Hello my dear friends, I'm the Otter. I'm going to review every single coil shock on the market with no marketing bullshit or pro riders involved. So let me give you the very short answer before I give you the very long answer. OHLINS and EXT are the absolute kings when it comes to coil shock suspension. These are motorsports brands, like they build suspension for cars and motorcycles, and they build heavy duty, extremely advanced damping mechanisms, while mountain bike brands are way behind the curve and build shocks out of paper mache. About 8 months ago, friends, I built this spreadsheet and it's linked in the description. So version 1 of this spreadsheet has quite a few typos as far as prices and everything, but I'm not going to delete anything on this list because there's still a lot of good information buried in this spreadsheet. So I will be continuing on the bottom of the spreadsheet for the October 2024 update. And we are going to start over here on the Otter's preferred list of coil shocks, worst to best. So let's jump into those reviews before I debrief you on the spreadsheet and why I chose this list. The TIGON is a pretty innovative piece of suspension. Take 3 on the Cane Creek TIGON. So it'll be on the third bike and the third spring. I chose my e-bike because it has a pretty awesome suspension platform with a progressive rear end. So I will be sacrificing this e-bike into the bike park moon dust. Let me just tell you, my first warm-up run on the TIGON after a thorough couple days of setting it up on normal trails went absolutely terrible. So I basically went back to the car and had lunch and was scratching my head, and this is what I came up with. So because this shock has a digressive shim stack, I think we need to use a little bit of air inside of it because essentially it just becomes inconsistent with the bottom out control. Now I've never heard anything positive about a digressive shim stack, and I'm going to join the team of not a fan of this style of shim stack. So with the TIGON 5 PSI, pretty sick jumper. Throughout the Cane Creek TIGON adventure, I found this shock to jump excellent. So more or less, it feels like an air shock when you are jumping. Okay, so the high speed rebound felt a little bit too fast on some of the jumps. So we're gonna go to middle. At this point, I'm essentially questioning my sanity because it felt pretty awesome at some points and pretty terrible at others. What you can learn from the TIGON is anytime you make a spring adjustment or an air ramp up tube adjustment, your entire setup will go out the window. Your rebound and compression settings will basically feel like absolute trash. Now, anytime I'm on a smooth blue flow trail jumping, the TIGON is pretty darn impressive. So essentially, I feel like I'm on an air shock 90% of the time of the TIGON. The Rocky Mountain Altitude is not a silent bike. It has definitely got some noise coming out of it, but it was exceptionally loud. So understand this is worst case scenario at a bike park in the moon dust at the end of the season, so there's a lot of braking bumps. But I'm pretty paranoid, guys, so basically I pulled over and was trying to diagnose what the sound was coming from. Now, upon close inspection and being a pretty good detective at finding noisy, rattly, loose bolts, I found the spring loose on the TIGON, like dangerously loose. So at this point, I'm kind of suspecting that the gold retaining spring on the bottom of the TIGON is basically unwinding itself at the bike park. Now this could be completely unique to me as far as the spring unwinding off of the shock. I'm kind of notorious for every single bike I ride, it basically rattles apart when I'm at a bike park. So that is one reason this shock could be feeling extremely inconsistent. The spring is basically unwinding itself from its preloaded position.
Get it right.
It's the elevation, it's not. I wasn't the only one struggling with suspension setup, and then I had to remember I'm at 6,000 feet, 1,800 meters, and other picky people about suspension were struggling as well. So the TIGON does have an air spring inside of it. Anytime you have an air spring at high elevation, things can get a little bit wonky. I feel like the shock was riding better with 5 PSI in it. I wasn't getting that harsh spiking bottom out. So a spiking bottom out would be kind of the nature of a digressive shim stack as it gets easier to bottom out deeper into the travel. Now, I would go off one jump and it would feel good, go off another one and it would feel absolutely terrible. So the name of the game for the bike park day on a progressive linkage at high elevation was inconsistent for the TIGON. The bike park was an absolute disaster on the TIGON. Utterly disasterful. So what's essentially happening is the spring rate is changing. If you want to watch the rest of that Cane Creek video, which is not very long, you can become a channel member. Moving on to second from last place, we have the RockShox Deluxe Select Coil. Now, I never rode some of these shocks and I fully will disclose that, but I will use the information from riding the other shocks to gauge these ones that I have not rode. Moving on to number 22 on our list, we got the RockShox Deluxe Coil Select. So I'm pretty sure you cannot buy this aftermarket because I looked and could not find it. So there's a couple good things going for this shock, why it goes ahead of the TIGON. It is a true coil shock. There is no air in here. That's why the TIGON is in absolutely last place. You want to remove air from the equation when you're running a coil shock. So there's a couple things I love about RockShox right here. See those sag indicators? Making your life pretty darn easy. We got 20 clicks of rebound, so we have a massive range and number of clicks. The same as the RockShox Vivid Coil and the Super Deluxe Coil. So moving down the technical list, we have a digressive shim stack, which is a red flag. Digressive shim stack means it's easier to bottom out deeper into the travel. So I think that's the main problem with the TIGON. It's a combination of a digressive shim stack and essentially having air in the equation, which you do not want. So RockShox uses Maxima Plush fluid, which is not the best fluid. You could get better performance by putting Motor X oil or different weight oil in here. So what this shock is, the Deluxe Coil Select, it is a placeholder for a bike like this. And this is the only bike I could actually find it on OEM. Moving down, it's kind of interesting because it goes to 165 eye to eye all the way to 250. So it's just a placeholder for super cheap bikes so they can market it as $2,000 bike. Moving on down the coil shock list, coming in 20th place, I believe, Cane Creek Double Barrel Coil Inline Shock. So this is a pretty interesting shock because it only goes up to 210 by 55 and it's kind of catering to the short travel bikes. I personally think you should be on an air shock if you have a short travel bike. This shock's also not compatible with the Levos, Canevos, Stump Jumper Evos, and it won't even fit in the big travel bike, so what's the point? Anyway, this shock is actually pretty sophisticated. Like, Cane Creek knows how to build some pretty awesome equipment. This shock is pretty impressive for the simple reason it has a twin tube damper, high and low speed compression, high and low speed rebound. So let's talk about the climb switch, why I'm knocking this shock so far down the list. So we're gonna zoom in. I've never rode this shock. I don't have short travel bikes. Do as you please. Do you see this massive climb switch here? You're gonna end up bumping this and riding on it and it's gonna feel absolutely terrible. Cane Creek chooses to not put clicks, or if it does have clicks, they're very subtle and hard to find, making their suspension extremely difficult to set up. Now, I've heard really good things about this shock because it does have a bladder instead of an internal floating piston. We will dive into that a little more later. So let's say you got this thing set up correctly on your short travel bike, you could have some pretty good performance. Just no clicks and this massive climb lever, I would really struggle to get this set up correctly. This list is worst to best, Otter's list. So you may have different opinions, but we're gonna jump into the DHX. So I spent months riding, tuning, rebuilding this shock, and I'm gonna give you the entire series. And just remember, at the end of the video, I will justify all these choices. Now, this is Fox's attempt at making a RockShox product featuring 12 clicks of marked low speed compression. This is the only Fox shock that has numbers on the compression lever. Like I said, it's Fox's attempt at making a RockShox product. She features 10 clicks of low speed rebound, and this adjuster is a little bit difficult to use. But let me tell you the most important thing about the DHX. She's got a super thick shaft. And did I mention it's made out of hardened steel? And who doesn't like a girthy, hard shaft? But hold up. Do you see this thing behind the shock? Well, it's called a yoke. And if your bike has one of these things, be very careful, okay? Now, any pre-2024 Specialized bike is unapproved according to 9 different people at Fox. Even though on the Specialized website, it says the Levo can use the DHX. And the 2024 Kenevo Comp comes with the DHX. So this is a bit confusing because this Kenevo Comp is the exact bike. I have a 2021 Kenevo, and we can tell it's the same from the pictures and the geometry chart. Now the bottom line is, if your frame breaks and it's pre-2024, Fox is not going to help you. So if this nerd talk isn't getting you fired up, let me put something stiff on it. Woo! Okay, this is a 205 by 60 shock, and buy a 2.8 Fox spring to match that shock. Now the damper is the oil part, which you're looking at, and it weighs 1 pound 1 ounce or 0.49 kilograms. Now if you buy a DHX, you're probably cheap, so you're going to buy the cheap shock or the cheap coil, and it weighs 2 pounds 3 ounces altogether, and that's pretty darn heavy. There is a weight penalty for running a coil shock. The super light DVO coil comes in at 12 ounces, and that is 4 ounces lighter. I don't know if it's worth the extra 80 bucks. Now, if you don't want your garage to look like this, you need to buy that. It's called the Spring Dex. It's an adjustable coil spring from 540 all the way up to 610, so you can kind of adjust how it feels on the trail, and it's actually easier than adding air to an air shock. But to get the full Fox experience, I'm going to take it out on a 600 pound spring that costs $40 and see how it goes. So the first thing that sticks out to me on the Fox DHX, well, it feels like a really stiff coil shock. Usually they're just like super supple off the top, bro. For sure, the DHX is an excellent pedaler, but this should not be the reason you bought a coil shock. Am I wrong? Aesthetically speaking, the DHX is definitely a handsome shock, and I am a fan of that thick steel stanchion, and I'll talk about that extra rod on my stiff shaft a little bit later. So after our 3,000 foot sufferfest uphill, the first descent on the DHX was a little bit surprising. Since the Fox Float X is the best trail shock ever made of all time up to 2024, I was a little bit surprised to find that Fox DHX not as supple off the top and kind of blowing through all its travel. But this is the first ride, so I don't want to judge it too hard. Now, when it comes to all-day epics, boring single track with epic views like this, personally, I'm going to reach for a Fox Float X at this time. The DHX has been pretty disappointing so far. Now, coil shock, air shock, they're all compromises. Usually, you get a slower moving shock with a coil with some additional traction. But when it came to the steep sections and tight switchbacks, the DHX is not giving me the additional traction that I expect from its compromise in weight and everything else. Now, with a 60 pound lighter spring, the small bump sensitivity of the DHX is still very disappointing. Now, it is better than an air shock, but it's disappointing for a coil shock. Let me explain further. Now, this is a 540 pound spring on the DHX, and it looks like an air shock when I'm pushing on the saddle. And this is a Suntour VORO. We can see it has much more small bump sensitivity to small inputs. Checking out the Fox website, as we can see, the biggest shock they make is 230 by 65, and that's the one I have. It's not really a big downhill plush bucket like the DHX2. You potentially could have a better experience with a 210 by 55 shock. And I may be an Imperial Princess complaining about his small bump sensitivity, but I'll always try to fix something I'm not happy with. Now, one benefit of a coil shock, and especially the DHX, it's a very simple shock. Basically pull the spring off, and a crescent wrench will pull the main seal head out of the shock. And let's check out what Fox is doing inside of here. Now, this is the main technology within the DHX, and it's kind of a massive piston, even in comparison to a Fox Float X2. So when I pulled this piston out, there was quite a bit of friction, and that may be where this shock lost its small bump sensitivity. Now, the DHX takes lighter oil than even the Fox Float X2, and it feels like it has less small bump sensitivity. So it's kind of interesting. So of course I'm going to try to butcher this thing together in the Sam Pilgrim garage. This is Motor X 2.5 weight oil. Super expensive good stuff. We're going to fill her back up and do a botched home bleed job. Now, Fox went full RockShox on this guy, and it's pretty easy to service and doesn't require too many special tools. You can get the bleeding done with that Break Bleed Shimano kit from Amazon for $20. And the DHX, being a coil shock, it doesn't have that floppy foreskin, or aka air can, to put back together. So once you're done bleeding, you're basically done. Now, this is before. We can see there's not much movement. Now we have quite a bit more movement in the coil, but we gotta go ride it to see if it actually worked. Now, this is the third or fourth ride on the DHX, and I got a really interesting fact about the DHX. Basically, I was struggling on the rebound settings, and then I ended up running the same rebound that I run on a Fox Float X, and that makes sense because it's the same damper, just has a coil spring. Now, if you've ever rode a Float X and used this guide, you can basically copy the rebound settings into the DHX. So the performance with the faster rebound is much better on pounding blue flow trails. I was having an absolutely amazing time. So don't be afraid to walk your rebound faster, one click at a time on the DHX. Now, the small bump sensitivity, I'm gonna say it's 15 or 20% better with the lighter damper oil. And keep in mind, this is kind of a gray zone. I don't know if it's going to ruin the shock or it's approved by Fox, so do that at your own discretion. Now, my favorite thing about the Fox Float X, the air spring version, is it was an amazing jumper. So how does the DHX do in the mini jump lines? Well, it's harder to control through the travel because it's a coil spring, and that's kind of disappointing. And the other great thing about the Float X was it was a shock that you could move through the travel super quickly, and it is the best trail shock you can buy. And the DHX feels like a sluggish coil shock without the traction of a big heavy duty DH plush bucket. So basically, feels like this DHX has a identity crisis. She's got a big thick shaft, but she thinks she's a trail shock. So the rest of the day, I basically played around with spring rates and was comparing them to the calculator's suggestions. So check out this calculator because it gave me the best recommendation. Now, there's several spring calculators out there on the internet, but this is TF tuned, and it basically told me to run a 570 pound spring, and it was the absolute most accurate. And the only way to get a 570 pound spring is to get the spring decks. Now, I suspect the lack of high-speed compression adjust or bottom-out control on the DHX is the real shortcoming. So why is the DHX so unpopular? I don't know. The performance of the DHX in the chunky, rocky tech trails is really good. It lacks small bump sensitivity. Now, the real deal breaker for me personally is this shock kind of sucks on blue flow trails. The Float X is a better shock. So rewatching that DHX video, I thought the performance of it looked pretty good when I was watching the shock move on the trail. So maybe I'm being a little hard on it, moving it so far down the list. But you have to remember, I'm comparing every shock on the market. So holding the DHX up to the EXT STORIA is a really hard place to be. So basically we're going to move on to the Fox DHX live valve. And let me run you through all the details on that shock from what I can see on the paper, because I obviously don't have this shock. It is too expensive. That's why I'm basically putting it so far down the list. So diving into Fox's marketing campaign, it's basically the same shock as the DHX. There's nothing different. But if we put all of this stuff into our cart, like the DHX and the sensors you need, we're at $1,400. So going back to our list up here, the only shock on the market that's more expensive than the live valve is the Push 11.6, and that is a purely custom tuned shock to you. Pull it out of the box and you're completely done. So with the DHX, you basically have low speed compression and rebound. So that's why essentially I'm knocking that DHX live valve so far down the list. So the list may change later when I get one and the marketing, the new hype cools down. It could be pretty awesome. So I do have a video on the MARZO Bomber CR shock, and I will basically put that one on the screen for now. The last product in the MARZO suspension series, we got the Bomber CR coil shock, aka the old school Fox van shock, so I've read on Reddit. Now the most important thing about this shock, it is super affordable. But is it that good in 2024? Well, you're gonna have to watch the video to find out. So inside the box, staying true to its roots, super simple. We got an owner's manual, setup guide, and some awesome stickers. Suspecting no internal changes for the 2025. We do have some new cool logos. They come in gray and black. Pretty awesome if you're a depressed millennial, or if you don't want to look like a dollar store hooker with your Kashima coated lowers. Regardless of the internet trolls, MARZO is becoming cool again. We got some MTV, you heard that right, MTV. If you're from the 90s, you remember that, themed logos. And these are going into the collection and not the trash. The Bomber Coil features low speed compression, the most useless adjustment in rear mountain biking suspension. When you have a coil shock, you need bottom out control, not the slow speed part of the travel. The low speed compression knob is pretty hard to turn, but good news is the rebound adjuster is pretty simple to use and it turns fairly easy. So the part of the shock that controls the oil is called the damper, and this one weighs 360 grams and about 12 ounces. And if you're cheap and buy the $40 Fox spring, it's going to be 860 grams, or 1 pound, 14 ounces. My coil shock curious obsession is getting absolutely out of control. Let me show you. I've got about 10 different coils, and the best piece of advice I can give you is buy a spring dex and pay the $150 because it will save your ass. Attaching the rear coil to the MARZO Bomber CR is super easy. We have one C-clip retainer and the top piece just winds itself on. There's no indexing like the DHX and the DHX2. The spring dex makes the coil shock look pretty ugly, but it's got so much function, it's definitely worth the compromise in appearance. Now this is the Bomber CR with the Fox coil spring, and it definitely looks quite a bit better. I could have sworn the Bomber CR, I read somewhere, had a 14mm aluminum stanchion, but I needed to check how thick it was, and I have some really bad news here. It's only a 12.5mm aluminum stanchion, making it one of the weakest coil shocks on the market besides the DHX2. I'm gonna put the Bomber CR on this specialized peasant status, and let's just call it demonstration purposes only. So you see that yoke on the back of the bike? It likes to destroy coil shocks, and Fox and MARZO shocks are notoriously weak. Even though this shock is approved on Fox's official website, you can count on this shock breaking in the long term. There is no clear answer from Fox. Their technical document says this shock is safe, but then you have bikes like this that it snapped the coil shock. So I'm putting this disclaimer out so you don't put this on your bike and have it break and you get hurt. So put this coil shock on a yoke bike at your own risk. Very important thing to know, besides this shock having a 12.5mm stanchion that's super weak and could snap, it has a super long piggyback that can interfere with your bike's frame and cause serious damage, so you need to know if it can fit in your bike. So if you want to know how a shock's going to ride, if it's going to have small bump sensitivity, you're just going to push on the saddle and see how it moves or reacts to small inputs on the saddle. So I can tell you this shock has decent small bump sensitivity from bouncing on it. Starting out on a 540-pound spring deck spring, it does have a lot of small bump sensitivity here, but jumping in the parking lot, I'm getting near the bottom of the travel, more than 85% bottom out off of feel, so I tighten her back up to about 570, which is normal for my body weight. It's kind of interesting, since my 57-pound e-bike and this 35-pound specialized status, I'm going to run the same coil spring. Parking lot test has been completed, very promising. Let's hit some gravel. The MARZO bomber has an excellent rebound range. If you're a heavy guy, I can't vouch for the lightweight riders, but I can tell you I was about 3 clicks from fully slow, which is absolutely awesome because of my heavy body weight. Now, every shock has its own characteristic as far as rebound and compression, and sometimes you just can't get along with a shock, but I can tell you right out of the box, the MARZO bomber is getting along with me, and I'm a really hard guy to get along with. When I say I'm hard to get along with, it's because of my 230-pound body weight. Most shocks are tuned for people, between 130 and 190 pounds. So if you're on that outlying heavy side or the super light side, you can have problems with shocks getting along. I'm definitely not pushing the bike because it's the initial test ride on this brand new frame, and I'm not used to Amish bikes. But the MARZO bomber is really impressive so far. I got the compression wide open, rebound 3 clicks from slow, and I'm basically set and forget. Very impressive, and it does feel quite similar to the Fox Van shock. One notable thing is this is on a modern bike and it doesn't pedal bob too much. The small bump sensitivity out of the MARZO coil shock is really impressive, and I'm super picky. In order for the bomber coil shock to maintain its small bump sensitivity, you have to run the compression in the wide open setting, and you need some kind of progressive coil. And guess what? The spring dex is partially progressive on the bottom 20% of the travel, giving you some bottom out control. Impressive performance from my short ride on the Bomber CR, but unfortunately, this was a brand new bike with the tire leaking and the brake lever, so I had to cut it short. Not the best with math or spreadsheets, if you can notice. So number 7 on our worst to best coil shock list, we have the X-FusionRear Shock H3 CRSP. So I couldn't even find to buy this one in the United States, and it's kind of a limited edition, maybe worldwide, you could buy it somewhere. So the reason this goes ahead of the DHX and the MARZO is because we have a higher level of compression control with this shock. The yellow tab back here is basically a knockoff of the OHLINS. This is also a knockoff of the OHLINS. We have a 14mm aluminum stanchion, I'm guessing. So it's only available in a couple different sizes, but the important size is right here and right here. These are the enduro bikes, and coil shocks are for enduro downhill bikes. So moving on down the thing, we can expect some pretty good performance out of this because we have a large range of compression, but diving into the service video, I did find an IFP during the service. If this one had a bladder, it would move way up the list. Coil curious adventure continuing. So I don't want to spend too much time buying an X-Fusion shock and you don't even know if it's discontinued or not. And same holds true for the Super Deluxe next on our list. So this came out in 2023. And it was done in 2024. It was less than a year. So I nicknamed it the discontinued damper, and I didn't make too many friends with that video. But I will put it on the screen, and I am a huge fan of both of these shocks for having hydraulic bottom out. The discontinued flagship from RockShox, the Super Deluxe Ultimate Coil. Now let's hope it's better than the Air Shock. And there's a lot of good information in here, so even if you have one, you should watch this. A 12.66mm aluminum stanchion is a definite improvement from the last model, and it does have a reinforced eyelet, so we're making strides in the right direction. So this shock is not approved for the Specialized Kenevo. So this is demonstration purposes only. Don't buy one for your Kenevo unless somehow you can find the steel shaft Super Deluxe or add the steel shaft in. If you have a shorter yoked bike like this Specialized status or a Levo, it is a go. All the new RockShox shocks have the same adjustments, 4 clicks of low speed and high speed compression and hydraulic bottom out. It has a massive range of adjustment, or range of adjustment, not clicks. 20 clicks, so a lot of clicks, and a massive range of rebound. So if you're like 100 pounds or 300, you should be able to get along with all the shocks that are coils, not air. So let me show you why they discontinued this piggyback. So I'm going to open up all the adjusters and put the rebound in the full fast setting. So here's that discontinued piggyback on the $10,000 dyno tester. So it basically takes like 66, 65 pounds of pressure to activate the damper. Now this is definitely on the heavier side of any shock I have ever tested. For an example, the Floatex I just took apart, it takes about 50. I'm 100% practical and not super theoretical, but from my experience, higher damper activation pressure means less sensitive shock to rider's input and less small bump sensitivity. Now the initial marketing for the Super Deluxe C1 2324 shock said no crosstalk. Crosstalk is RockShox's fancy word for if you add high speed compression, it will not choke up the low speed movements. And this shock, let's see what it does. So let me turn the high speed compression on and put it back on the dyno tester. Now pushing down with all my muscles, it basically breaks the scale. I don't even know, it's past 70 pounds if you add high speed compression. So that's why they discontinued the piggyback. So hard to push down. I probably did about 20 dyno tests with open hydraulic bottom out, open, close, this, that. If you add any adjustments, it basically goes above 70 pounds. It's not a bad shock. It's definitely quite the improvement. Like the Super Deluxe Air, there's nothing I could do to that shock to make it ride good. But the Super Deluxe Coil, you're just relying on the coil. And I'm actually petrified to huck the flat on this thing because I don't want to snap the shaft. Checking the small bump sensitivity on the Super Deluxe Coil, it is 100% better than the Super Deluxe Air. The coil spring isolates you basically from the fire road or the trail chatter. A little over 30% sag. Maxed out high speed hydraulic bottom out. Open compression. The rebound feels pretty good. That's good. I didn't even open the trailhead app this time, but I was at 7 from dead slow on the rebound, and it was 100% acceptable, leaving the compression in the wide open setting for the first run just to feel it out. Okay, I was using a lot of travel, felt a little bit dangerous, and like I told you, this is demonstration purposes only. You need the steel shaft Super Deluxe to run it on the long stroke Kenevo. But according to RockShox documents, it is okay to run the 210x55 on the Levo on this one. So being super cautious as to not have a hard bottom out and snap the shaft, I moved the high speed compression to the middle setting. Oh. So the Super Deluxe Coil, it's not so bad so far, to be honest. The Super Deluxe Air had kind of an imbalanced air canister, you know, they're on their third variation, but with the linear coil, the compression does work. You just have to be careful of it because there's so much. So basically we're max hydraulic bottom out, mid low speed, mid high speed, and this will be run 4. I won't make you suffer through too much of my bumbling, but basically I experimented, moved the low speed compression and the high speed compression to the middle setting so they were matching. Deluxe is a pretty good shock for the people, but personally I am a huge fan of these smaller brands like MRP, DVO, because they typically have more performance than your big box store like the Super Deluxe. So I've been hot on the trails for an MRP Hazard for quite a bit of time. It's a little bit on the expensive side. It's $729. So the reason I stopped trying to review every shock in the market, this one may be discontinued as it is sold out. So there's an excellent technical write-up from NSMB here, and I got all the information I needed to in one photo in this review because I'm a millennial who doesn't read. There it is right there. So we have low speed compression, high speed compression, and I found an IFP in here, so it's definitely going to hold back the performance of this shock not having a bladder in the piggyback. But we do have a high level of compression control, and this shock's pretty impressive for having a 14mm steel stanchion. There is only 3 shocks on the list with a 14mm steel stanchion. Oh, that's how I figured it out. It says right there, IFP. So we're not going to have as much performance from an IFP, but we're going to have more reliability. But on past the MRP Hazard into number 11 of worst to best. So I am definitely favoring the shocks that have a bladder inside the piggyback because they have more performance. All DVO shocks come with bladders because they know what's up. They're the original MARZO. I'm a huge fan of DVO. So I was looking for a DVO Jade for a super long time, and I could never find a 230x60 shock, so I reached out to DVO and they told me it's discontinued. And that makes perfect sense. As we can see, they posted a video 10 years ago on this shock with 26-inch wheels. I guarantee this shock is timeless, top level performance. Now, everything is a compromise because it does have a bladder inside the piggyback. It will have less reliability and shorter intervals. That holds for the JADE X as well. So I have rode the JADE X and it's a little bit funny with a 3-position compression lever. Kind of don't know where to put it. It's pretty awesome because it's simple, but these shocks are way down the list because they're discontinued. Moving past the old DVO shocks into unlucky number 13. It's just funny how it turned out like that. We got the Cane Creek KITSUMA Coil. Okay, this is a 4-way adjustable, high and low speed rebound, high and low speed compression. The problem is they don't put clicks on the frickin' adjusters. So setting these shocks up is extremely difficult. This is a bladder style shock, so if you did get it set up right, it could be absolutely amazing. So check this out. With a 30% off coupon, it's like $500 or something. That's a pretty good deal for super high level performance suspension if you can get it set up correctly. Now, I'm going to need your help here. The KITSUMA coil looks so promising, I actually bought one. So I buy used suspension. If it's blown up, I rebuild it if it's worth my time. So Cane Creek is a small market, so it's not worth me investing the time, the learning curve to rebuild it. So one of 3 things here, and the third one, I need your opinion. Cane Creek shocks are extremely unreliable and they basically blow up in less than a year. Number 2, the owners don't take care of them, and this one's 3 years old and never been serviced. It's a used shock, I don't know, but I need your input. I can tell you putting this on the $10,000 dyno with 33 pounds of damper activation force and a bladder inside the piggyback, it will be high performing if you can get it set up correctly. So I didn't ride the Cane Creek KITSUMA coil because basically I don't know if it's discontinued or not. I gotta wait until the market levels out because the bike market is in chaos. So number 14 on worst to best is the best dollar to performance ratio on this entire list. Like, look where it's at, number 14, all the way up here. So this shock is truly, truly impressive. I can personally say I've rode this shock for months. It's literally my backup shock in between my shock flipping to make videos. So here it is. The Suntour VORO, they don't say much about it except for it's an internal floating piston. So the Suntour VORO is a licensed DVO Jade, and Suntour just basically puts their own little touch on it, and this thing is just truly impressive with a 14mm steel stanchion, adjustable IFP pressure. Basically you set the pressure at 180 and this shock is legendary performance. Considering the price, I'm gonna say it's the best shock on the entire list. So there is some fitment issues with the piggyback being pretty large, and let me put the entire video on the screen for you. Massive steel stanchion and a huge piggyback. The Suntour VORO is a classic mono style shock with an IFP piggyback. To put this in plain English, a mono style essentially means the oil only has one path to flow. What this does is it makes the shock more reliable, it makes it more simple, less moving parts, and you're not going to have a whole bunch of adjustments like a Fox Float X2. An IFP piggyback basically means it's like most shocks on the market, and it's very simple. The massive piggyback comes in about 4 inches and that many centimeters, so be careful because you could have some potential fitment issues with this shock on your bike. The Suntour VORO features 16 clicks of rebound. Like I said, the mono style limits the external adjustments, but the shock's so easy to take apart, it wouldn't be too hard to tune it later. The VORO features 6 clicks of low speed rebound. So there's not a whole bunch of information on the VORO or video, so I emailed Suntour and this is what I got back. We got an oversized 14mm steel stanchion, so fear not on your long yoke specialized bikes. Now, John couldn't be 100% certain that it wasn't going to break, but I decided to send it because of that large steel shaft. The clicks are super defined on the compression, and the manufacturing that Suntour does on their higher end products is pretty darn impressive. So I essentially traded my Fox suspension for this stuff, so I decided to give it a good thorough test. So the IFP on the piggyback goes from 180 to 300 psi. I was a little bit concerned because my IFP here only had 126 psi, essentially meaning it was 60 psi low. So the air pressure within the piggyback helps the oil to stay in oil and not get cavitated like the X2. But let me tell you about my first ride on the VORO, because it didn't go very good, because right here I ended up pumping it up to like 300 psi, and let me tell you how it went. With the IFP pumped up to 300 psi and a 600 pound spring, the shock was absolutely garbage. It felt like I was oversprung and then undersprung and going through all the travel, and I was like, yeah, I would expect this from a $400 shock. In an attempt to save the day, I opened the spring as much as I could and opened the compression, and it actually made it worse. After my first ride, I was pretty disappointed. I was like, wow, this shock really does suck. But remembering I had the IFP to 300 in the beginning of the ride, I decided to let the pressure down to 180 and take it out for a ride. Now, taking the shock out at 180 psi in the piggyback with the 600 pound spring on my most familiar blue flow trails, I was completely blown out of the water. I'm pretty sure this is the best shock that's ever been on my bike. And remember, this shock cost $399, effectively making it the cheapest shock that's ever been on my bike. And remember, from this email, if you read it closely, John from Suntour says, hey, don't go above 220 and you are just going to have the most amazing ride. Had to stuff this in the front of the video because it's so important. So back to the normal program of boring tech stuff. The Suntour VORO damper weighs 15 ounces, that's 425 grams with no spring. If you're a cheap ass like me with a steel spring, it's going to come in about 1 pound, 10 ounces, and that many grams. So I couldn't figure this out for the life of me because this was a used shock. So basically this large spacer thing was on my shock with a DVO coil. So DVO makes this little spacer thing so you can run smaller springs on a bigger shock. If you look at the Suntour website, it tells you the correct shock to ride or the correct spring, and the 230x65 takes a 2.8 inch long spring, so they tell you which spring to ride. So double checking the marketing, we do have a 13.99 millimeter steel stanchion, and you can tell it's steel just from that look. The aluminum stanchions are usually black. Now, holding the Suntour VORO shock in your hand, you're like, is this a bicycle shock? It kind of feels like it came off a CR250. It's literally like a motorcycle shock. They just stuff into bicycles. Really awesome if you have a 57-pound e-bike. Maybe not the best if you have a light duty trail bike, but who knows? So we're back to pre-first ride. Always stuff that coil shock or any shock in your bike and take a good gander at it, because it's always awesome to have a new shock. But don't forget to depress the suspension and look for frame contact. All clear on this one. For all the Specialized owners out there, I got a little piece of advice. So you see that bottom out bumper deflecting? That is kind of a buckling force that can help snap the coil shock. So you want to make sure you're on too heavy of a spring rather than too light. Correctly sprung is actually correct. So we're looking at a Fox Float X2 bumper, and we can see it's essentially the same thing, but it's hidden inside the air shock. So my used VORO came with a DVO 450-pound spring and that little spacer thing on the table. So if you have smaller springs, just order that little spacer from DVO and save yourself a bunch of money. But make sure that spacer goes on the top of the spring and you're going to be set. Well, I wasn't about forking out $90, and I just happened to have a 600-pound Fox spring in my quiver. And it doesn't quite fit into the Suntour clips. It's a little bit too small for it. The Fox spring was so close to fitting, I decided to take some files and file the paint off the inside of the Fox spring, and let me tell you, it fits on the Suntour coil after you file the paint off. So measuring sag by yourself on a coil shock is never fun, but you can get the job done with a couple online calculators I linked in the description. So this is the reason you ride a coil shock. It's just absolutely supple off the top. Everyone's favorite quote. In steep, wet, rooty trails, the coil shock absolutely shines. It needs no introduction. But the Suntour VORO is extra special because it's a very slow moving shock, allowing the bike to grip more of the ground, and you're just gonna feel extremely confident. This is what really caught me off guard. You would think this massive motorcycle shock would compromise you on the jumps, but no. Its slow moving, very predictable nature is just absolutely a beast in literally every type of trail I've ever took it on. It allows me to ride safer and faster than any air shock I've ever been on. And don't forget, the thing costs $400. So I need your help again here, guys. Anyone riding a VORO or experienced with one, please comment, because there is no information on that shock and we got to get the word out for that affordable price tag. So moving into number 15 here, we have the Fox DHX2 Factory. So there is more won races and marketing behind this shock than any other suspension on this list. So let's jump into the video and find out why it is truly a world-class shock. The Fox DHX2 has probably won more races than any other piece of suspension ever. So when a brand doesn't change something frequently, that usually means they got it right. So in this video, I'll tell you how it rides from a mediocre standpoint, and we'll dive into the internal nerdy stuff before I go take it for a ride. So I had to do a full service on this, and I completely stripped it down, like pulled the piggybacks off, so I could basically see what was going on inside of it and try to explain to you in a dumb mechanic standpoint. So no engineer talk, basically this is what you got. A pretty sophisticated compression assembly, like behind the high and low speed compression adjuster. We have an extremely stiff spring, a shim stack, and from my experience, this is one of the better adjusters. Like, it really does a good job at fine tuning your high and low speed compression. So comment more if you're above me as far as knowledge on this high speed and low speed compression adjuster. So here's the main piston of the DHX2, and it's super sophisticated because basically we can move the shim stacks in the oil flow around from the high speed rebound adjuster. Independently adjusting the high speed rebound on the Fox Float X2 and the DHX2 doesn't really do that much, but if you move it in conjunction with the compression adjuster, it does a massive tuning range. And it is definitely one of the most impressive pieces of engineering because it basically moves the shim stacks around on the main piston. Tucked up underneath the piggyback, we have another compression base plate oil control valve. So when you move the climb lever, basically these little ports open and close. So effectively the DHX2 has 3 forms of compression control because it's not a climb lever, it's just a firm lever. And I couldn't find anything that said you can't ride on it, and I ride on it all the time. This is how a shock works. It is extremely simple. So we have the main piston that compresses oil, and then it rebounds oil. Compress oil, rebound oil. Compress oil, rebound oil. The main reason shocks becomes more expensive is because these oil control valves become more finely machined. So this is a twin tube shock, and whenever you see the word twin tube, it's basically just another tube inside of the main piston, and the smart engineer guys can basically flow oil around it and backwards to make a more sophisticated oil control valve. This service job is fairly easy and readily available, and any bike shop can take care of this for you. While everything is a compromise in life, and the DHX2 is one of the most sophisticated pieces of externally adjustable suspension on the market, Fox had to compromise the external structure of the shock in order to get all these adjustments. So because of that compromised external structure of the shock, it tends to be the most infamous shock on the internet as far as braking. So we all have to thank Darren from Push here for educating me and bringing this to you. So the eyelet on the DHX2, because of its high speed rebound adjuster built in, is heavily compromised. And there's only a couple little threads holding the eyelet on the shock, and that's the true weakness of this shock. It's not the thin stanchion. Here's another perspective from Bryce at DVO. Depending on the thread pitch and how many threads are on the eyelet will dictate how strong the stanchion is. All these are correct in some way or another. So we have a 10mm stanchion, so we have a 10 by 1.0 thread. That is a pretty small machine thread holding the eyelet on the DHX2. To further reinforce why coil shocks break, I think I cover this in every video, the OHLINS shock has a 10mm stanchion, and it is one of the strongest shocks on the market. And then we look at the EXT, and it has a heavily reinforced eyelet instead of a hole carved out of it for a high-speed rebound adjuster. Now the DHX2 has won more races than any other shock on the market, so you can just blame Specialized or the bike brand for making bad designs. That's completely up to you. Moving on to the $10,000 dyno, the DHX2 is extremely impressive at about 34 pounds of pressure all the way through the stroke. To put this in perspective, the RockShox Vivid basically breaks the scale when you get to 50% of the stroke. So the DHX2 is going to be a very linear coil shock on the trail. The DHX2 is a pretty coil shock, meaning you need to rely on the bike's progressivity to make sure you can ride this. It's a DH oriented shock. Rocky Mountain, perfect match. If you are on a more linear suspension type, you may run into problems or need to run a super heavy duty progressive spring, and any progressive spring will fit on this shock because Fox uses very narrow coil springs, so you can add in MRP, DVO, or Cane Creek springs to the DHX2 if you do want to ride this on your more linear trail bike. Getting into the clicks on the DHX2, same clicks as the Fox Float X2. Highly adjustable shock. With 30 pounds of damper activation pressure, let's do the small bump sensitivity check. Truly impressive small bump sensitivity out of the DHX2 because it is a very linear coil shock. So it does have some top out on a fully fast rebound. Moving it to the slowest setting, there's no top out, but the shock is completely dead. And I'll let you know at the end of the video how the DHX2 holds up to EXT OHLINS. The DHX2 on the proper bike is pretty incredible. The Rocky Mountain altitude is extremely progressive in the rear end. Even the lightest progressive setting at 37% is super friendly to the DHX2. I would highly consider you look into your bike and make sure it's progressive before bolting up a DHX2. So let me put this plain and simple. You get out of the DHX2 exactly what you put into it. So for the first couple weeks, I was riding the DHX2 in the recommended setting and barely putting any effort into it, and it was a pretty mediocre shock. Right away, I knew a faster rebound on this shock was making it feel better, but being a lazy mountain biker like most of us are, we don't want to put in a tuning session. So with mediocre performance Out of the box from the DHX2, I knew what I needed to do. Heading out to the test track, doing a complete in-depth setup video on the DHX2, the performance back out of the shock was day and night. After the tuning session, heading into the high country to see how she would perform with a much better setup.
Okay, that's climb switch firm, no pedal bob.
With the newly found setup in the DHX2 hucking into the rock gardens, purely impressive traction and confidence. So I basically just set up the stupidest, fastest rebound possible because I want my bike to be kind of poppy and lively and do jibbing fun stuff on the trail because I don't race. The DHX2 is so adjustable you can achieve this, while maintaining a high level of traction and confidence in the chunky trails. My trailside footage is pretty weak and I'll be working on this, but my riding's also weak as well, but just consider Jordy is a pretty average rider and sets up race-winning bikes. So it's not all about skill when it comes to suspension setup. All things considered, the Fox DHX2 at $679 at jensenusa.com. So that was the original video, and I rode this shock for a couple weeks. There's a couple things you need to know about this shock. I think it would do best with a progressive spring, even on my Rocky Mountain with 37% rear end progressivity. So what the DHX2 can do is drop your bottom bracket down because it's such a linear coil shock, making more pedal strikes. With the bike market in absolute chaos and fire not in a good way, like melting down, I need to wait for the market to cool off because this shock could become discontinued and it's such a small market, it's not really worth my time to make the video. So let's dive into this pink bike review and let me weed you through the weeds. So they definitely got this shock for free, and Casimir and Pink Bike are dependent on brands paying them for reviews. I'm trying to move out of making bike videos, so I'm going to tell you the truth. Definitely world-class performance out of any Push product. Darren at Push is one of the most knowledgeable people in suspension. High and low speed compression, a steel shaft, so it's compatible with Levo, Kenevo, which is a really cool thing. The overall performance of this shock is going to be held back by its internal floating piston design, and I strongly disagree with the ending of this article I was forced to read because there wasn't any pictures. He says the SV8 is less damped than the OHLINS. That's absolutely nonsense. The OHLINS is substantially more active on the trail, making a poppy, fun, lively feel. And there is no arguing OHLINS' high-speed damping prowess. Like, the faster you go into OHLINS, the better it feels. So I don't think this is a bad shock by any means. It is missing hydraulic external bottom-out control. Alright, so that was a quick one on the SV8. I would definitely rank the SV8 above the DHX2. So you have to understand Fox is all marketing. Not all marketing, but it's like 50% marketing, 50% performance. So you can expect the SV8 to be a better shock. Now, I'm ranking the RockShox Vivid Coil above all of these shocks for a number of reasons. From sag indicators, easy to use, hydraulically externally controlled bottom out. So let's jump into that quick review video. Is the new Vivid Coil a simple rebadge from the Super Deluxe, or is it all new for the ride or the trail? Let's unbox this beast. So it comes in a eco-friendly packaging with no plastic. Inside of it, I'm like, what in the hell is all over this shock? So when it was shipping from China, it was basically rattling around and getting a whole bunch of cardboard transferred onto the shock. This isn't a big deal, you just spray it off. So when we look at this new Vivid Coil, it feels precisely the same as the Super Deluxe coil. There's absolutely no exterior change except for a Vivid badge that's in black and white instead of saying Super Deluxe. RockShox has been using DU bushings since the 40s, and it maintains the same DU bushings into 2025. Now, I was reading some comments from a long time ago, and you need to be careful with the adjusters on these shocks. You can snap the high-speed compression adjuster off very easily, so know where you're turning it. So this piggyback is the touchdown technology. So let's put it on the $10,000 dyno and see if the marketing holds true. Damper activation pressure will tell you a lot about a shock, but it won't tell you everything. So when I push the Vivid Coil down, the first 10-15 millimeters of travel only takes about 30 pounds of pressure. So this is super impressive for straight off the top. Now it's only like 10 or 15, basically how much you see right there, where it's 20 pounds of pressure. And that's kind of the sag area of the shock, so I don't know how that's going to affect it on the trail. Once we go deeper into the travel, it goes to about 45 pounds. And then when we get to mid-stroke, it basically breaks the scale. Very similar to the Super Deluxe. So now it's time to put it on the bike, and cleaning off all that cardboard transfer is not hard. All you have to do is spray the shock off, and it's basically brand new again. So my goal is to give you practical, useful information, and all the review channels will say it's amazing, go buy it. So it is very simple. It has sag indicators, climb switch, 4 clicks of high and low speed compression, hydraulic bottom out, and probably my favorite, the spring says 65mm stroke. So we have 4 clicks of high and low speed compression, but you need to understand it has a massive range. So if you add 1 click of high, add 1 click of low, or the shock will feel like trash. If you don't have the rebound, at least in the middle, it'll feel like trash. It'll feel dud, slow, dead. So when it comes to the hydraulic bottom out, that's purely dependent on how progressive your bike is. So I'm going to be running this Loner Levo with a long stroke Cascade kit, and I'm basically going to solve this tune business that all the commenters have been whining about. I am not the most diplomatic person, so I'm naming the Vivid Coil the Band-Aid damper, kind of like Buttercups. Basically, they discontinued the Super Deluxe Ultimate in less than 2 years and came out with this guy. So let's shoot for 3 years on this one, whoop whoop. And I'm gonna put all my Super Deluxe Ultimate coil settings into the Vivid Coil and see if it works. So just so you know, the long stroke Cascade link for the Levo has a 98mm long yoke, so technically it's not approved to ride from RockShox. Now this bike is super progressive, so it should be okay. So if you have a 65mm RockShox coil, you can only have a 72mm long yoke. So Specialized Status has a 71mm long yoke, so it sneaks in there. And I've rode the Super Deluxe coil on the Status, and it's an excellent shock for that bike because of the hydraulic bottom out and the climb switch. Now, I'm a little bit lazy, so I didn't put it on the Status. But here's one note. RockShox uses super wide springs, so MRP, DVO, Fox, basically no springs fit on RockShox because they're so wide. So you're like Spring Decks and RockShox, and that's about it. Since the Levo is the most popular e-bike in the world, basically I'll tell you how this goes. It's kind of a pain in the ass to transfer the hardware because you have to hammer it out blind. If you have the long link Cascade link, it's a super tight fit. I don't know if they designed it to be that tight, but it's kind of a pain in the ass to mount up a new shock. So you're probably not changing shocks every 3 days, so this isn't a huge deal, but for me, it's kind of a pain. Let's do the small bump sensitivity check on the Vivid Coil touchdown technology, aka Band-Aid damper. Now I don't have much to complain about here. It looks like they added in small bump sensitivity, and it's about time. So maybe RockShox engineers were watching my crude videos, or people were complaining, or they're just trying to FOMO you into the next shock.
Who knows?
Let's talk about some positive things with the RockShox. So setting sag with sag indicators is a really good experience. Like, you can actually get 30% sag confidently and quickly without much fuss or friends helping you. So if you have a Zeb on the front of your bike, the Vivid Coil is an excellent match, coming at you with the hindsight. So I ride a lot of mixed suspension, and sometimes when you have Fox in the front, RockShox, DVO, whatever, mix up, it can be pretty challenging. The damping theory between the Vivid Coil and the RockShox Zeb makes setting the whole system up much easier.
Okay, I'm on the Loner Levo. It's a little bit different feel. It's like a lot shorter of a reach, even though it's size extra large. And I was kind of lazy to change the pedals, so flat pedals. So the Vivid Coil, I have the exact same settings as the Super Deluxe a couple weeks ago. Mid compression, mid, high, and low speed compression, and 11 clicks of rebound. So right away, the Vivid definitely feels like a better damper. It's kind of like soft throughout the stroke. It doesn't have that choked up feeling that the old RockShox did. Come on, Steve.
While cautiously taking my time on this new bike and new coil shock, I found the Vivid coil performance to be very similar to the Super Deluxe, except for there's one key difference this time around. The standard trail riding experience is excellent compared to the Super Deluxe and any other product that RockShox has made before. So this shock is not choked up into its travel, giving you small bump sensitivity, isolating you from the trail like no RockShox product before. But that's not the real key difference this time around. So I'm riding a specialized Levo with that silver link back there, holding the shock in place. It effectively makes the bike more progressive, harder to bottom out. So remember, this is a Vivid C1 tune, but this bike is more progressive than anything Specialized has ever made, at 33 or 35%, effectively making this shock amazing. Not because of the tune, because of the bike's leverage rate being more progressive, because I'm a heavy rider who likes to clap it out on blue flow trails. So really the shock tune is not as important as the suspension kinematics. So the Cascade component, the silver link back there, has made this the best coil shock experience I have literally ever had. Now, I could just go buy a Levo and this link, or buy this bike from my friend, but I've decided I'm going to buy an actually progressive bike from this ride. So let me give you the good with the bad, because it's a completely unsponsored video and I don't want to be a sellout. So, the RockShox uses an IFP inside the piggyback. So IFPs are definitely having a slower response time, making jibbing, jumping, popping off things not quite as effective. Now, it's not as handicapped as a Fox DHX, but it's definitely not as good as a DVO when it comes to popping and jibbing and flowing. But the RockShox is an excellent shock for your trail bike because of the hydraulic bottom out and the lockout switch. After like an hour and a half, I was completely dialed on this bike, so I went full send for my C+ riding skills. So really the bike's suspension kinematic is keeping this bike up in its travel and more composed. And it is definitely a pretty impressive coil shock. All dampers are getting so good in 2025, it's hard to go wrong, except for a Fox DHX. So I'm putting the Vivid coil into the upper middle class of performance. But there is one massive benefit to being upper middle class. There's not much adjustment period because it's not going to feel completely foreign. Now the top end performance, the high speed damping, how the oil feels when it's slamming back and forth inside of the shock is not going to be as good as OHLINS, DVO, EXT, etc. But if you don't want to do a whole bunch of setup and adjustment period, the Super Deluxe and the Vivid coil are pretty awesome. So let me tell you my logic behind putting the Vivid so high on the list. So the performance of it is quite a bit better than the Super Deluxe. It's not day and night difference, but it is better. The overall package RockShox delivers with suspension is incredibly intuitive and easy to use. Anyone can get on it and basically get it into the ballpark. There's a lot to be said there. So we're going to move into the Gucci brands now, the higher end brands, and you kind of get what you pay for. The performance of them is on another level compared to the last couple shocks on this list. The EXT STORIA V3 is an ancient shock, especially in mountain bike standards, like 6 years old. So right when I got it, boom, this came out. And I was like, damn it, now I gotta get one of these. Anyway, the main difference between the V3 and the V4 I'm gonna discuss in the front part of this video. And it's an excellent time to pick up a V3 because they're going to be heavily devalued or on clearance because they're definitely discontinued. So I almost paused production of this video, but I realized there wasn't really a super in-depth video on this shock. There's only like 4 or 5 videos and they're kind of surface level. So let's go deep on this guy and see if this archaeological dinosaur can hold its own 6 years later. First thing you should know about EXT, they overbuild the crap out of their shocks. We have a heavily reinforced eyelet, making this safe on most or all Specialized bikes according to EXT. It features a 14mm aluminum stanchion. Yes, steel would be better, but because of this reinforced eyelet, it does make it okay to ride it on a yoked bike. One improvement for the V4, we have a chromoly reinforced steel shaft. The STORIA V3 features 10 clicks of low speed rebound, not the hugest range in rebound. And it's a little bit finicky to use the knob, especially when there's a coil spring on it. The range of it is pretty small, and it also doesn't say slower and faster. It says plus and minus. So plus is slower. Plus is slower. A little bit hard to wrap your head around it, but if you think about the rebound piston, adding plus closes the oil flow off, making it a slower rebound. I don't have the V4 in my hand, but the rebound adjuster does look like it has changed, and hopefully it's improved because it's a little bit tricky to move when you have some gloves on. This ancient fossil features hydraulic bottom out, long before any mountain bike brand even knew what that word meant. So it has a super small bottom out bumper because the oil flow is stopping the bottom out. This old dinosaur, the hydraulic bottom out, is preset from the factory or the service center. They told me they could crank it up during a service. On the picture of the V4, we can see an extra bulge on the top of the shock. This is so you can externally adjust the hydraulic bottom out control. The V3 features 14 clicks of low speed rebound. It's a massive range, and don't downplay it because you might need it for the next video. One bummer of the V3 is the high-speed compression adjuster. You have to use a 12mm open-end wrench, which is an absolute pain in the ass because you have to carry a wrench around or their special little tool. It does make a super cool pop. One great improvement for the V4, it looks like we got a 5mm Allen key to adjust the high-speed compression. Now these are kind of small potato adjustments except for the hydraulic bottom out. I do want a V4 external hydraulic bottom out, is awesome to have. But let's talk about the real change in potatoes. So we are looking at the damper flow of the V3. If you check out the piggyback, it features an IFP sliding up and down. Now IFP is basically like a piston, and it has a whole bunch of friction, and 99% of shocks on the market have this. Reading through the technical documents about the V4, this is the real improvement. All EXT shocks now only come with this. Instead of that sliding up and down high friction IFP, they feature a bladder. In this video, I'll tell you the pros and cons of basically both. So let's do a small bump sensitivity check on the V3 with an IFP. Now this is an EXT V3S, basically eStoria internals with the bladder inside of the piggyback. It is incredibly more small bump compliant and sensitiver to rider input. With any high level suspension, it takes some work to get set up. Now EXT does tailor their whole thing to setting up shim stacks and clickers for you, but if you buy it used or you don't like the way it rides, it does take some information, knowledge, and patience to get this stuff riding good. This goes for any high level suspension. I may have figured out the secret setup for all mid-level and upper tier shocks, but that will be in probably the next video. Now taking a look at that V3, it is definitely a good looking shock. It has a super unique finish. It definitely stands out and goes with virtually any color of bike. Let me take you on this epic all-day backcountry adventure on this ancient fossil we like to call the V3 Astoria. Don't let that ancient 6-year-old age fool you. This is world-class damping, but that does come with the compromise of you needing to do some tweaks on the trail. I'm gonna guess a couple rebound adjustments and definitely playing with the compression. But you need to know the most important adjustment on any EXT coil, and I rode all of them and had mixed success. It is the spring rate. On this ride, I forgot the 12mm spanner, so I have the high speed compression in the wide open setting. I can only adjust the low speed, and I don't have a spring dex on it. I have an EXT 600-pound coil, so I'm basically stuck with a pretty heavy spring for my weight. I'm usually like 570. So carrying on these normal cross-country trails, to be honest, there's no benefit if you're just casually riding on bougie suspension. When things get chunky or high speed, that's when these bougie coils, we're gonna call them dampers, really come to life. It sounds like absolute chaos under you. You have to know that high-end suspension does make a lot of noise. EXT shocks, they're all kind of similar when you put them into this high load, high work environment. They just sustain more hits than your normal style damper. It's an unexplainable feeling. It's like it has artificial intelligence and it just hangs out in the perfect mid-stroke, sustaining absolutely every rock, root, and bump. And it's an unexplainable feeling, to be honest. But I did find a way to explain it, and basically EXT calls it high turbulent flow valves. I've experienced this in the new Grip X damper from Fox. What it feels like, the oil is not moving back and forth. It's moving around in a violent circle that gives you an excellent ride. While the damper's performance was absolutely legendary during that savage riverbed descent, the whole package of the shock is not working in harmony. And there's one secret you need to know about this shock. If you bought too heavy of an EXT coil, you're never going to get the right performance. So that's why I still tell you to get a spring Dex, even for these bougie coils. Because this way we can drop the spring rate way down. You have to understand how bougie dampers work. They do so much work, the spring doesn't have to do as much work. So I normally ride like a 570 to 600 pound spring on a normal shock. On EXT, I'm 550, and that's how I get the magic feel. So another thing to note, EXT coils and OHLINS coils, these stubby little coils, will give you more performance. They're lighter and they have more small bump sensitivity. I've done back-to-back tests on OHLINS and EXT, and these stubby coils are the way to go. The V3 Astoria is a dinosaur, and so are IFPs, so EXT doesn't make them anymore. We can only get a bladder shock from EXT unless you buy an old one or a used one like me. So after a week on the V3 Astoria, I honestly think the IFP style shock rides better at absolute high speeds when you're trying to pin it. Now the bladder gives you the most insane control over your rear wheel. It will turn you into a trials rider, and I definitely prefer the bladder, but for the right price, I'm definitely on the IFP. Okay, we are moving into number 18. Above EXT IFP shocks, we have the VORSPRUNG TELUM. So I worked super hard to find this shock used and actually reached out to VORSPRUNG and asked them for a demo shock and questioned some of their design choices, and that probably wasn't the best idea because Steve at VORSPRUNG thinks he knows everything. I think he's super smart and the inspiration behind my channel, but I don't think he knows everything. So let's look at this VORSPRUNG TELUM. So it's basically a copy with taste, not copy and paste. Copy with taste of all the best attributes of every coil shock on the market. We'll start on the head of this shock right here. So we basically copied the Fox DHX2 compression and rebound adjusters because this is the best design. It's easy to understand and use. Moving into the eyelet, it looks awfully similar to the OHLINS, so this is definitely a very strong shock with probably a 10 to 12 millimeter steel stanchion. So they don't approve this on specialized Levo bikes because they want to save face. If this shock breaks on a Levo and goes on the internet, it's not good for business, even though it's probably plenty strong enough. So it does have externally adjustable hydraulic bottom mount, which is an absolutely awesome feature and why it ranks so high on this list. And it's a copy with taste of EXT right here. That's where EXT puts it. And basically we're copying push, the custom tuned valving for each shock, and a pretty affordable price tag considering this one's $1,200 and the push is $1,600. But it is version 1, so I'm gonna rank it behind the push because push has been making shocks for years. So I asked Steve a few questions, questioning his designs on the shock because I'm like, hey, this might be a problem I have with the shock. So here is one of the responses he told me. The only difference between a bladder and an IFP shock, so basically I asked him, why do you use an IFP in the shock? And he's like, there is absolutely no difference. You're an absolute idiot. I have all this dyno data, blah, blah, blah. And honestly, I do not agree. If you jump on an IFP shock and then you jump on a bladder shock, the bladder one will basically be night and day different. It cures all the coil shock problems of slow response rate. So basically when you're on a bladder shock, it feels like you're on an air shock because it pops and plays like substantially better. And obviously this is just some guy making a list of all the shocks he's rode and trying to compare them on the internet. So that's why I'm ranking the EXT the same as the TELUM. These are IFP EXT shocks. And then the next question I asked Steve was, why are you using Springdex coils? And he got super upset, or not super upset, but explained his thing that everyone is an idiot on the internet. So I personally find the EXT and the OHLINS stubby coil springs to have more performance, and he says it's placebo and all springs are springs, even though Springdex claims their spring is progressive. So someone's right here, someone's wrong. It's probably me who's wrong, but I super respect VORSPRUNG, and that's definitely an awesome shock. It is definitely possible that Steve is 100% correct as far as springs being springs, and the stubby OHLINS EXT springs are basically the same. It could be an optical illusion according to him. But the question is, why is OHLINS using these stubby springs? The most prestigious name in all of suspension. Basically building F1 sports cars, why are they using a bladder inside the piggyback if IFPs are the same? Because we all know that IFPs are more reliable. If you're chasing performance, it's in a bladder. Okay, we are getting towards the end and I'm getting tired. It's been about 8 hours. The Push 11.6 I'm ranking above the TELUM. I've spent a bunch of time on the 11.6 and I actually have a brand new one to make more videos with. So the best shock you can get, guys, is the one you can get on the biggest discount that has the most expensive price tag, because you usually get what you pay for. So let me give you the 11.6 in-person review before we cross the red line. This is the most expensive coil shock on the entire market, and it's the only piece of suspension that's fully manufactured, assembled, and sold in America. So this shock is super expensive, yes, but check this out. So you may save some money by buying a RockShox, but you're not going to be able to get parts after 5 years of use. A shock could last longer than 5 years. This 11.6 is more than 5 years old, and all you have to do is mail it into Push, have it serviced, pay a little extra fee, and you're fully up to date. So going expensive can actually be cheaper in the long run. Today I'm going to be riding the up-to-date 11.6, not the one I just showed you. At first glance at this shock, you're like, wow, it doesn't even have a piggyback, but it's off to the right. That's for fitment, so this probably fits in every single bike in the market as long as your budget is allowing. The 11.6 features 16 clicks of low speed rebound. It is a massive usable range because I was not on the dead slow number. So you can be very heavy or very light and get along with the rebound settings. For sure, the 11.6 has the most range and compression of any shock on the market. I basically lost count, but I pulled this off their website. It's got over 20 clicks of high and low speed compression. Now there's a massive range in compression and rebound, but if you buy it direct from Push for $1,600, they will revalve this thing, set up the compression, put the spring on and the mounting hardware, basically bolt it into your bike and never think about it again. If you opt for the cheaper version from jensenusa.com, you need to not fear, because Push has the absolute best setup guides in the entire mountain biking industry. They are open source, ready to go. Even if you buy this shock used, they are very friendly and open. America. So basically, it's this massive page of where to set the compression and what spring to use. There's a 2-position lever on the 11.6. If you put it to the up setting after following the setup guide, it is the firm mode. If you put it to the lower setting after following the setup guide, it's the DH plush mode. De facto customizable climb switch, I'm gonna call it. The setup guides are a little overwhelming, but if you have a highlighter and a pen, a little bit of patience, you will be absolutely dialed. One caveat to the setup guide, they are bike specific, so if you have an oddball bike, it's not going to work. But today, I don't have an oddball. Pretty standard stuff inside the setup guide, except for it's recommending me a 500-pound spring for my body weight. So that tells me this is a heavily damped shock from the factory. The push spring comes in at 395 grams. And if you're American, that's 14 ounces, so it is not a light spring. It does have some technology built in, like a barrel shape, so it doesn't bind. It's gravity oriented suspension and it comes in at 1 pound 15 ounces, nearly 2 pounds, so it's not a lightweight. The push hyper coil is available in 25-pound increments, so you can get super dialed. The 11.6 coil I'm riding today features a 12.63 millimeter aluminum stanchion. So every 11.6 is very bike specific. They can make an oversized steel stanchion if you have a Levo or Kenevo. But today I'm going to be riding the alloy one on an Amish bike. I'm forced to ride this 11.6 on a YETE SB150 because of its aluminum stanchion. It was a little disappointing I couldn't rip it off and put it on my e-bike. But manufacturers like Push use aluminum stanchions because they can get a better coating on the stanchion. The small bump sensitivity response from the 11.6 looks absolutely outstanding. The parking lot test told me this is a heavily damped shock, and I already know this because it told me to ride a 500-pound spring, and I am a heavy dude for a 500-pound spring. So if we think about the shock setup like computer programming, basically Push gives you all the programming, so you should be able to have it pretty dialed on your first ride. Now when you buy a high-end Fox shock, it can take like 1 to 3 rides, and maybe you could never get it right. As a certified coil shock snob, the 11.6 has world-class small bump sensitivity on normal trail riding. It really isolates you and your body from the trail when you're just cruising around. Being a little nervous on a brand new shock and bike, I was like, well, let's give it a shot. The most impressive ground hugging traction I have ever felt. Climbing back out of that hole was super impressive, but we have to blame YETE for its good climbing kinematics. Being so heavily damped, it has its pros and cons. Like going over routes, it completely isolates you from them and you barely even feel them. The standard trail riding experience on the 11.6 is outstanding, but it does kind of numb you from the trail. Now you may like that feeling and you may not. Different strokes for different folks. Coming into this huck to flat, I was really concerned about that light spring, but check this out. The Push 11.6 has a form of hydraulic bottom mount, not just your standard.
Our twin piston hydraulic bottom out feature also adds progressiveness to the end stroke of the shock, but in a different way because it actually requires speed sensitivity to activate. So while you may go deep in the stroke, the hydraulic bottom out feature may not activate if the shaft speeds aren't high enough. The hydraulic bottom out piston is designed to add in high levels of additional compression damping to support the suspension only when needed, such as large drops or really deep square impacts. Whether it's low speed deep G-outs or huge hucks to flat, the two systems combined provide you with the ultimate in bottomless feel.
That's Darren, the founder of Push. Super nice guy. He did help me make this video. I asked him a whole bunch of questions. Very knowledgeable, friendly, and nice. Excellent to support a small USA company. Now I want you to check this section out. This was the most impressive section of the day for the Push 11.6. Steep, rooty, completely planted on the ground with pure confidence. So if you have that kind of terrain in mind, the Push 11.6 is like the most ground hugging traction you can physically get out of any shock I have ever rode. The 11.6 is 2 shocks in one. All you have to do is move the arrow up or down to your preset settings and you basically got 2 shocks in one, right? This is the setup guide on the Push website. So basically it'll tell you where to put it, how you want it to ride. So I definitely went for plush DH mode in the bottom arrow direction. and I want fast flowy jump lines for the up direction. So on the lower half of this trail, I flicked her up in the up position and went through a couple jump lines. I'm not the most talented rider, but I definitely found a noticeable lack of pop out of the rear suspension on the 11.6, even with the precise settings that they recommend. Keep in mind it's got like 28 clicks of compression and you can play around with that. But the push is an amazing shock. I didn't like that setting, so I reached down, moved the compression lever. I'm back in a DH plush mode that I was really enjoying. In the firm compression mode, it felt somewhat like a DHX, obviously quite a bit better. In the DH plush mode, it gives you that characteristic of the DHX2. It is pretty awesome to have two shocks in one. And don't forget about the widest range in compression literally ever made, and push can also revalve this shock if you don't like the way it rides. The most impressive thing I found about the 11.6, you run a 500 pound spring and it's got incredible ramp up at the end of the stroke. Like, I don't know how they can do that. It's got a lot of sophisticated oil control valves, hydraulic bottom out, and a ton of compression. Now, if you like a lot of compression and like to mute the trail and not feel it underneath you, this is the most standout shock ever. Push 11.6 at $1,600 is the most expensive shock on the list. It's made in America and it basically makes American jobs, and it has super high level performance, but its internal floating piston, personally, I'm gonna leave it behind the red line, even though I have one of these because I got it for super cheap. So anything below the red line is my personal top picks, like the ones I would put on my bike with my money. So number one of my top picks here, even though it's below the top shock, is the JADE X Prime from DVO. It's $600 plus $150 custom tune, somewhere around there. We'll say like $800, you're getting a custom tune shock with legendary damping from a company that's bridging Gucci from mainstream with top level performance. I just hope you like green. So let's watch this short video because I was still on a Specialized bike, and they don't approve them on Specialized bikes because just like VORSPRUNG, they need to save face being a small brand.
And I was so happy to take that Super Deluxe off.
DVO suspension is criminally underrated. So this coil shock is not perfect, but you will get all the information in this video to find out if it's a good fit for you and your bike. So the JADE X Prime has some more sophisticated damping compression valving inside of it. DVO told me they eliminated hydraulic spiking issues, added high and low speed compression adjust, and kept everything on this shock that was working excellent. So I'm coming at you with hindsight. So they kept the bladder inside the piggyback because bladder systems are far superior to any IFP Fox RockShox product on the market. The high and low speed compression adjust isn't the full story. So we have a new updated base valve inside of there, new shim stacks, and new areas for the oil to flow, retaining that same compact piggyback so all your water bottle and bike fitment issues may be solved. When I say most of your fitment issues may be solved by a compact piggyback, it may not. While testing almost every single brand suspension on the market, fitment is a massive concern. So the JADE X Prime moves out horizontally, so you may run into fitment issues if you have a certain frame. I'm gonna give you some examples here, like it may not fit on a propane frame or an Orbea Wild, because those have like a compact area where the base or the head of the shock sits. So the JADE X Prime features 10 clicks of high-speed compression, 5 clicks of low. DVO says if you need more than 5 clicks of low speed, you have your shock set up wrong. I kind of beg to differ, but let's agree to disagree. So inside the piggyback, you retain that same user-tunable piggyback air pressure system inside the bladder. So my first round of DVO suspension was pretty awful because I wasn't aware of this. But after testing like 25 different coil shocks on the market, almost every single IFP on the market, used shock I get has low IFP pressure. So by DVO pushing this maintenance on you, it's actually a good thing, and you get to tune your shock with it. It's time to put this shock on the $10,000 dyno tester. So we have about 52 pounds of damper activation pressure, which is about middle of the road. So if you want to know the worst, it is RockShox at 66 pounds and the best is EXT. This is pretty fair for what you're getting. It's a $600 shock, the JADE X Prime. So you're getting about a middle of the road damper activation pressure. The rebound adjuster, I'm not sure if it's updated because I didn't have the old one, but it has about 16 clicks and a nice big plus sign. That means slower. Moving it plus is slower. Pretty fairly easy to use. So setting sag on a coil shock is never fun. So this is how I do it. I put a dowel caliper around the coil spring, shooting for about 28% sag because this coil shock with the hindsight is pretty linear. So this is demonstration purposes only. I'm running this on my SR71 Specialized Kenevo Blackbird, and DVO does not approve putting their coil shocks on Levos, Kenevos, Stump Jumper Evos. So I'm like, what the fuck? And DVO said, after much research and lab testing and replacing people's frames, we choose to not support these yoked bikes. In order to build it to our standards, it would be super heavy. And could you imagine the mountain bike journalist saying it's 100 grams heavier than everybody else? So I fully understand where DVO is coming from, but you are a complete weenie and should be on this bike if you measure stuff in grams. So my $10,000 Harbor Freight dyno tester never lies, so this thing is not super supple straight off the top. Remember, you get what you pay for. It's a $600 shock. DVO brings you high-level performance suspension at a pretty affordable price tag. This may not apply to all bikes, but the rebound adjuster is fairly large, so you can actually get your dick beaters in there and move it with the spring. The high and low speed compression is toolless, so you can basically move it on the fly depending on your bike layout. I am a massive fan of bladder style coil shocks, and let me show you why. They are super sensitive to rider input. You put a tiny little fraction of a pound into it, you can feel where the rear wheel is moving. If you watch some of my older videos, I will tell you EXT is the best, and this is coming in a close second at 50% of the cost. But let's go ride it and see how it goes. I'm using a 525 to 650 pound DVO progressive spring. This is a little bit of an insurance policy for hard bottom outs. I'm going to say this a couple times in this video, they do not approve it on the Kenevo and the Levo. So I'm using that little insurance policy of the spring. I talked to them about that 525 pound spring and I'm like, why isn't there a heavier one? Because I had to give it 3 full turns of preload to get it to the correct sag. They said, hey, we're a smaller company, it costs us a fortune to make springs, but we'll do our best for you big boys out there. Always take your time on new suspension, no matter what it is. So go in for the small bump sensitivity check that I check every shock on the market. It is world-class small bump sensitivity, isolating me basically from this fire road. So the 52 pounds of damper activation pressure isn't the full story. The bladder is kind of conforming and deforming, giving it world-class small bump sensitivity. I'm the setup guy, so let's talk about it. So if you have a linear bike or you're a heavier dude, just go for the maximum bladder pressure. I was about 50% compression, 50% rebound, and I pretty much had this thing set up in about 2 runs down the trail. I enjoy the Tinkerfest. You do not need to do this on this coil shock. It has a super responsible range of compression and rebound. In the bladder, air pressure and the piggyback, just base that off weight. If you're heavy, go for the max pressure. But getting it set up perfectly how I like, going for a full tilt run, this is a really impressive shock so far.
And I was so happy to take that Super Deluxe off.
I could spend an 8-minute video beating around the bush, politely, softly telling you that DVO is better than RockShox, but let me make it very black and white. DVO has better damping. It is more sensitive to rider input because of the bladder. Now it's not perfect, so you gotta watch the rest of the video. So I pulled the progressive spring off, put the spring decks on it, and headed into the backcountry. So like I told you, it is very sensitive to rider input. So on trail riding, it's an excellent experience because you're getting pretty far into the travel and it just feels soft.
It's such a wildly different experience not being clipped in. I am so impressed with it.
I'm a pretty mediocre rider and my line choice is pretty questionable unless someone really good is in front of me and I can follow them. So the JADE X Prime is pretty legendary for that because it's so supple, allowing you to adjust the rear wheel and know exactly where it is at all times. So with the spring decks coil bolted on there, I did discover somewhat of an issue, so let's talk about it. So my first ride on the DVO was on the progressive DVO coil, and it felt pretty darn good. So on this ride, I'm on the spring decks, eating through the chunk, and my Nikes on top of my Shimano SBD pedals. And basically, I can feel the rear wheel wallowing way into the travel, like not even on a drop, just in the roots.
So it feels like it's a linear coil. I think it actually did better with the progressive spring. But man, the bladder inside the piggyback, like once you try a shock like that, it's like EXT, OHLINS, DVO, Formula has it. It's just incredible. Like it's just so sensitive.
So I'm going to remove the spring decks and go back to the DVO progressive coil because the experience was much better because of the linear nature of this coil spring. So if you ever feel dumb when you're setting your suspension up, don't feel dumb. I had this tool for 6 months and couldn't figure out how to use it. So I emailed them, asked a few questions, and it's called the reverse component sag measure tool doodah thing. So once you bolt it on between the coil springs, you have to loosen these tiny little 1/4 millimeter nuts and calibrate it to your shocks stroke. So I felt like a complete idiot because I had this for 6 months and never tested it. So it's going to be an excellent test to see if I'm bottoming this shock out. Once you get it all calibrated and on your bike, you still have to do a little bit of math. So I have a 65 millimeter stroke and 30% is about 20 millimeters. So that's where I ended up, a little above 30% sag, and this was actually a mistake. Coming at you with the hindsight, this shock likes to be probably at like 25% sag on these linear bikes. This isn't the most ideal situation, but this is the spring I have. The 525 DVO spring, I need to bring it up to about 570 to get the right sag. So I had to get a pair of pliers and kind of wrench on this thing 3 full rotations. So I did a little research, and the heaviest progressive spring you can get is from MRP, and it's 600 pounds to 750 pounds. I think it'll fit because the MRP one's super wide, but don't quote me on that.
Okay guys, check this out. The DVO shock is incredibly sensitive because of the bladder inside the piggyback. So I'm about 10 feet away from this jump, and I have it in the hardest gear, and I'm clipped in, and it just allows you to get the biggest preload pop. It's incredible.
That was fully the weakest jump ever, but you didn't come here for my riding skills. I'm not Remy Motalier, am I? So my final setup ended up being a full locked out compression, nearly full fast rebound, and this shock was performing at another level. Super sensitive preload pop off every little root and bump. If you like to jib, this is the best shock I've ever rode for that. Or one of the best, okay? The DVO JADE X Prime is a very coil shock, meaning it is super linear. So if you have a super progressive bike, this would mate up absolutely perfect to that. Lightweight rider, absolutely perfect. Questionable trail bike, definitely go for progressive spring. DVO also offers custom tunes for any riders out there. I basically pounded on this coil shock responsibly with the progressive spring on it, and it didn't break. It features a 14mm aluminum stanchion, technically stronger than RockShox. I suspect DVO's trying to protect their reputation by saying, do not put these on specialized yoked bikes. And we've all seen those broken Fox coils on the internet. That's bad for business. Moving past the JADE X Prime, we have the Formula Mod shock. Now there's not much information about this online, very small brand, so I didn't bother getting one because it's like 1,000 view video. So NSMB made a review of it, and I'm not going to read all this. All you need to know is it's Italian, so the damping is going to be legendary. You can swap out the compression assemblies, and there's a piggyback, a bladder inside the piggyback, so you can expect air shock level, pop, and performance with all the lovely things about a coil. Now it's not approved for specialized bikes like most of these on here, so I actually have a list for your specialized bikes. It is fully possible the Formula Mod shock is a dud, but it's very unlikely at $800 and having Italian heritage. So coming into second place here, we have the STORIA and the STORIA V4. Basically any EXT shock with the bladder inside the piggyback, you are going to have the most legendary riding experience. To date, I was going to say it was the best shock I ever rode. So there's a few secrets about the OHLINS, why I'm putting it into first place, but let's hear about the V3S STORIA. This shock is an absolute masterpiece, and here's the short answer. It's got more pop than a RockShox Super Deluxe Air, and it's got more small bump sensitivity than a Fox DHX2 coil. EXT may be a little bit less known on the mountain bike market, but they've been making high-end suspension for like over 30 years with a lot of motorsports technology built into this masterpiece. Now this shock is not perfect, so if you want the long story, stay tuned. Let's zoom out and look at the EXT lineup so you know what shock this is. So the shock I'm looking at today is an EXT STORIA V3S OEM edition that may not be available in your area. The V3S has the same internals as the EXT STORIA, it just has a different piggyback because it's an OEM edition. And the V3S does not have externally mounted hydraulic bottom out, so it's preset at 50%. Now it's on big time sale if you're in the United States, and I don't want to say numbers because they don't age well. The other two shocks EXT makes is the STORIA and the ARMA, and both the STORIA and the ARMA share internals, just the ARMA doesn't have an external climb switch. To let you in on a little secret, they're all world class and they feel very similar, they just have more or less features. This shock features an extremely small bottom out bumper. They get away with this because the shock has built-in hydraulic bottom out. Hydraulic bottom out basically stops the oil flow on the last 15% of the travel, so you can run a lighter spring and have a smaller bottom out bumper. The benefits of a smaller bottom out bumper: less buckling force when you do bottom out. Are you a fan of specialized bikes? Me too. And my bike has this huge yoke on the back. But fear not, because EXT doesn't mess around. This shock features a 14mm steel stanchion. Now there's many variables that go into coil shocks breaking, and it's mostly user error, like being undersprung or not servicing the shock. But EXT told me that all their shocks are approved, but they do recommend the steel stanchion like you can see here if you have a big old yoke bike. The V3S OEM edition does have one benefit over some of the other shocks. It has like 15 clicks of low speed rebound, so it has increased range because it was meant to go on OEM original equipment bikes. Now this OEM shock is missing the hydraulic bottom out, but she's got 12 clicks of high speed compression that is adjusted with a 12mm open end spanner that makes a massive popping noise. The low speed adjustment is achieved with a 4mm Allen key, and it also has a massive range. EXT may be the most real company in the world, so we got a lock switch for climbing, but it's also completely safe to use on the trails because it's got its own independent blow off circuit in case you forget to unlock it. And it doesn't fully lock it out, just adds a ton of compression. Okay, it's time to get the $10,000 dyno tester out. So pushing the EXT coil down, it's about 27 pounds of pressure to get it all the way through the travel. I have a whole bunch of shocks to compare this to. Now let's compare it to the worst coil shock I've ever rode. This is a Fox DHX, and it takes over 50 pounds of pressure to get this thing into its travel, which is almost double what the EXT is. This is the Super Deluxe coil with a small aluminum stanchion that's not approved for my bike, so I have to ride it on something else. But let's take a look at how much pressure it takes, and it was a little bit shocking because it was like 60 pounds of pressure. EXT is gravity oriented suspension, so it's no lightweight, coming in at 1 pound for the damper shaft and 1 pound 11 ounces with the coil. Here's a whole bunch of coils from the market. So that's the EXT coil, and it's like titanium super light coil. They do heavily recommend using their coil on their shock, but you never know what life's gonna throw at you, so I'm gonna try this whole batch of them. The Fox coil doesn't fit, the DVO coils don't fit, the spring dex does fit on the EXT, and the RockShox one does fit over it. I don't have any more coils to test, so that's what you got. The spring dex is an absolute time saver for your first ride on new coil shocks. Once you find your spring rate, you can basically go buy the pretty coil spring. The specialized suspension system does have a lot of small bump sensitivity naturally. If you have something like a Santa Cruz or a Pivot, they're not quite as supple. But when you pair this Specialized up with the EXT, it's absolutely mind-numbing and how sensitive it is during the garage test. We've got to go ride this thing. Riding through the parking lot on the gravel road, it's absolutely incredible. It's like nothing else I've ever been on. It gives the rider so much feedback. And it basically just breaks all the rules. It's got more pop than the last 3 Float X's I've been on. So even on cross-country trails, the EXT STORIA V3S is absolutely incredible. It gives you more mid-stroke support and small bump sensitivity than any shock I've been on. So basically the best riders and the most beginning riders are going to have a good time. And remember, the only thing that matters is having fun. So as I carry on, the balance of the bike is completely off. This is to be expected from a world-class suspension. It's not a set and forget it straight out of the box. The EXT experience is a super custom experience, unless you buy it used like me. So basically, I'm gonna have to spend the rest of the day tuning this, and you will gain some insight. So at this point, I dropped the spring rate down to like 540 and cranked the high-speed compression on. Now every shock has its own personality, and I just got done with the push coil, and the push coil likes a low spring rate and high compression. So I put those settings basically into the EXT, and it was a massive mistake. Every shock's got its own personality. So check this out. This is the precise moment that coil shocks snap during full bottom out. We can see the shock is buckling up into the frame, and every shock manufacturer in the world is cringing who's looking at that, because it's really bad publicity if a shock breaks. That landing would have broke a Fox DHX2, and it was 100% user error by dropping the spring rate 40 pounds and doing a big huck to flat. I want to save you all my bumbling down the trail, so I basically spent 3 or 4 hours playing with every single setting in the EXT coil, from the low speed compression to the high speed compression, to different spring rates, and this is what I found best. The best balance in this shock I could find was from running a 10 to 15 pound lighter spring than I normally run. To put that in perspective, on a normal coil shock with no high speed compression, I basically run a 570 pound spring because there's no external bottom out control. By dropping the spring rate like 15 pounds, I was able to add a whole bunch of high speed compression to get some of that world class damping action while maintaining its poppiness. And adding about 50% low speed compression, because the damping is so good, you do want to add it. With the shock completely dialed to my preferences, I swapped in an EXT fork, but that's a whole nother video. To simply put it, the EXT coil is like the supercar of rear shocks. It's more responsive than an air shock and plusher than any coil. It'll make you ride so fast, I was knocking my bike loose.
Oh, I knocked the brake lever loose. Can't believe I lost my chain.
The coil is notably predictable on steeper lips, and don't forget about the hydraulic bottom out catching you on hard landings. There was one trail right here, the coil did not work good. A steep, wet, rooty trail wasn't the best with that super active rear coil shock, so if that's your thing, you may need a different setup. Realizing later I could have just hit the climb switch to slow that coil down. Taking the EXT coil out into the high country, big alpine descent. How's she gonna do? Well, it's the most standout suspension you can possibly ride in slow speed technical rock gardens because it is so sensitive to rider input. You can basically place the rear wheel wherever you want it to be. I was like a de facto trials rider, and I've never had any urge to do any style of trials, but now this shock has me curious. Technical riding prowess with almost zero compromise on pounding blue flow trails. It's like having your cake and eating it too. Don't forget that quick response rate really spices up green trails, so anybody can have an amazing time on this. Now the big compromise on this guy, it's price. It is not cheap, I'm not gonna lie to you. But I spoke to EXT and here's some technology built into this shock to make it absolutely amazing. The STORIA, the E-STORIA, and the V3S both feature a negative spring to help with top outs and to return to the shallow part of the travel. Inside the piggyback there is no IFP, it's a bladder style. This helps small bump sensitivity. Everything in the shim stack is designed for mid-stroke support, so it basically pops back into the shallow part of the travel and it's not a wallowing coil shock. So the reason I put EXT E-STORIA bladder style EXT stuff into second place is because it is Italian and it is a little bit finicky. Some people will say they're absolutely garbage. If you get them set up right, they're absolutely legend. So let's jump into OHLINS and find out why I personally think it's the best shock on this list. When you think of suspension and you think of prestige, you have to think about OHLINS. So this is the TTX coil, and instead of getting all nerdy, I'm just gonna put it on the bike and go ride it. So it is definitely very impressive within about 10 seconds. Every shock I ride, I definitely compare it to EXT because that's the best rear suspension I've rode to date. And this is definitely giving the EXT a run for its money within the first 30 seconds. So I put minimal setup into this TTX coil, basically a 570 pound spring, a couple parking lot bounce tests to set the rebound. So I'm 2 clicks from dead slow in the rebound, which tells me this is a very responsible rebound range because I'm a heavyweight rider. The shock is pretty sensitive to rider input, but with any new suspension, you really got to take your time. I ride a Specialized Kenevo, and it has a 230/65 shock. It has a long yoke that likes to destroy coil shocks. So after countless emails to OHLINS, they assured me this shock was literally designed for this bike. It was the original Kenevo shock on the Generation 1 Kenevo. Now I had my doubts because it has a somewhat smaller stanchion than other shocks. So there's a whole bunch of things that go into coil shocks breaking. That's going to be another video. We're going to focus on the TTX here. If you're looking to buy the TTX coil, there's a fairly good chance that you ride better than me, but that doesn't bother me. Just so you know, I like to ride low and slow, try to maintain good style from a surfing background. So basically this style of trail right here, pop and flow, using the suspension's full travel to get little pops and flow is my game. The OHLINS is very sensitive to rider input, and this is definitely going into my top 3 shocks within about 10 minutes of riding. The slow speed prowess of the TTX coil is extremely impressive. First, small bump sensitivity on the OHLINS TTX, very impressive. We'll get all nerdy in a second after this ride and why it's so good in that small bump department. Coming into one of the most nastiest rock gardens I've literally ever rode through. The OHLINS definitely does not disappoint. This coil shock is truly impressive at this point. Probably beyond my riding ability. Passing through these horrible rock gardens, back to your pop and play. Absolutely excellent, because you can basically go through the entire stroke of the shock to generate awesome pop. For your average trail experience, there's excellent small bump sensitivity, and it's definitely above average. It does lack a few things that I'll touch on a little bit later. Moving further down this massive alpine descent, the OHLINS TTX coil really likes to go fast. It is definitely a rewarding shock the faster you go. Sometimes shocks can kind of fall apart at higher speeds. Even though this isn't my favorite style of riding, I can really appreciate the damping that goes into this shock at higher speeds. Hopefully my blind ride test on the OHLINS TTX coil has given you the confidence to get this shock, because it is truly impressive. But it's time to get all nerdy on this one. So the blue knob is the low speed compression. But what separates the TTX coil from literally every other mountain biking shock on the market is they have simplified high speed compression. We have a 3-position high speed compression lever, so if you need traction, go for the minimum. If you're on a jump line trail, maybe go for the mid. If you're going for pounding blue flow trails, click it into the firm mode and you can rest assured you are not going to have some hard bottom outs. As I've already experienced before, even in a poorly set up TTX coil, in the low high speed compression mode, it did absolutely excellent. Now this is one lesson every mountain bike brand needs to learn. So OHLINS basically overbuilds the crap out of their shocks, and this is one of the few Kenevo approved coil shocks. I probably wouldn't be sitting here making suspension videos if Specialized had put the correct shock on this bike like a TTX coil. Another super impressive thing about the TTX coil is this shock is $800 at JensenUSA.com. That is pretty darn impressive for the amount of performance you're getting out of this shock from the most prestigious name in all of suspension. If we take a look at the Fox DHX, it's $120 cheaper, and wouldn't you rather have a Lamborghini Urus than a Toyota RAV4? Now taking a look at that piggyback, whew, impressive. No water bottle fitments on your old school Levos, and definitely approved for your long yoke bikes. I was really concerned, so I did send OHLINS quite a few emails on this shock because it has a 10mm steel stanchion. 10mm is pretty small. You like to see 14, but there's a whole bunch of things that go into coil shocks breaking besides the stanchion thickness. So the weight of the TTX coil at 15 ounces is pretty standard, but they do have some specialty coils. They're definitely on the lighter side, but they go in 25-pound increments. So the whole package, the OHLINS coil and the OHLINS shocks, at 745 grams or 1 pound 15 ounces if you're American. But remember, we're riding our bikes downhill. Who cares about weight? The OHLINS damper body is pretty large, so the only aftermarket springs that are going to fit on this are EXT, RockShox, and the spring decks. The OHLINS shock is truly impressive. Extremely small, simple, and robust. I wish all mountain bike suspension companies would build shocks like this. Back to the test track, equipped with a lot more information. So like I told you before, the OHLINS is super sensitive to rider input, to the point it's giving EXT a run for its money at this point. So my test track here may be a very simple set of trails, but I've rode every single damper on the market, so I can measure it up against basically every other brand there is. I really like the OHLINS. It's super sensitive to rider input, allowing me to get excellent pop, and it's just a really fun shock. But realizing most mountain bikers aren't all about style and going low and slow like a surfer, usually they're like after like silly Strava times, I went down that section as fast as I possibly could. And I have a special surprise for you. The OHLINS damper at high speed is on another planet.
OHLINS, it's fucking phenomenal when you're out of control going fast.
The OHLINS TTX high speed damping is absolutely phenomenal, like some of the best or the best I have literally ever felt. So if you ride at high speed, just go buy this shock and stop watching this video because it's great. And for me, low and slow, it's absolutely phenomenal too because it's a super responsive shock allowing me to pop and play. It does this. I don't know how it does the high speed damping, but the slow speed response rate is because there's a bladder inside of the piggyback. Now this isn't new technology, this has been in motorcycle shocks for literally ever, but a bladder it has less friction, and it makes the shock respond better to the rider's input. So if you want a bladder, it's EXT, DBO, or OHLINS. There is a whole bunch of similarities between EXT and OHLINS, but I want you to pay attention to the springs in the back. Both EXT and OHLINS utilize this like short spring on a 65 stroke shock. So what I'm going to do is put the EXT spring on the OHLINS shock. Another weird thing here is the STORIA looks oddly similar to the TTX. The EXT coil fits right on the OHLINS damper. It is precisely the right height as the OHLINS spring, and the spring clips, it fits very good too. So another odd similarity here. So let's see if these shorter springs actually give better ride characteristic. I like to ride everything backcountry, trail center, trail riding, bike parks, anything and everything. So taking it out on a backcountry ride with the EXT spring loaded on there, there's no real benefit of a bougie suspension when you're riding like this. Any inline shock would be pretty much the same. But when things get chunky, that's when that extra price tag really pays off. The high-speed chundery section of trail, the OHLINS is just absolutely killing it. This shock is phenomenal at high speed, like I told you in the last section. The question is here, is that shorter spring giving it more performance?
The small bump is way better.
Not only is the small bump better, the performance of the shock is actually better by running a shorter spring. EXT and OHLINS are way ahead of the curve from all the other brands. I'll be trying to fit EXT coils to every other one of my shocks from now on. So if you know more about that, please leave a comment, because I personally don't know the benefit of running a shorter spring, but better small bump, better performance, and it's lighter weight, so I don't see how you can go wrong with a shorter spring. Why isn't everyone else doing this? Carrying on my backcountry ride, you gotta know this, the best trails in the world are not on trail forks. They're down weird fire roads in the middle of absolutely nowhere. So let's see how she does on those epic secret DH lines. Thus far, every single style of terrain I've thrown at this shock, it has been a absolutely top performer. So this is a backcountry DH loamer following the natural contours of the mountain with not a lot of tires on it. It's kind of like riding on a pillow. And we have enhanced performance from the EXT coil and a phenomenal damper in the TTX OHLINS. Remember the 3-position high-speed compression lever on the OHLINS shock? Well, it's super easy to use, to the point you don't even really have to get off your bike. So this trail is so soft, it is like riding on a pillow. And I usually ride in full high-speed compression, so I flipped it up into the soft setting to see how it would do on this pillow style of trail. And basically the performance just went through the roof. It was even better experience than before. So whether you have this shock set up bad or good, you're still gonna have a great experience. Being the diversified rider I like to be, heading back out into a trail center, I bolted the spring decks back into the OHLINS TTX coil to see if the performance was less. The performance of the shock was, I'm gonna say 10 to 15% less with a standard spring. So I would definitely opt for an EXT or an OHLINS spring when putting it on this shock. After a few weeks of riding the OHLINS shock, I'm super impressed. Basically, it has never let me down. This section of trail was what sold me on the EXT. It pops and plays better than an air shock. Holding up the OHLINS to that standard, it is definitely slightly under EXT STORIA internals, but I'm gonna say like 10 to 15% less. And don't forget the OHLINS shock is way easier to set up. From the first day to the last, the OHLINS TTX coil was one of the best experiences I have ever had. The first day, not knowing how to set it up, it rode absolutely phenomenal. By slowly dialing it in and putting the correct spring on it, the performance just increased. I've literally learned more from riding this shock for 2 weeks than almost all the other shocks I've rode combined. What OHLINS does in this shock, it's extremely simple. That's what we need to get back to in suspension. Simple and high performing. 4-way adjustable clicker clackers are for marketing. High performance is a simple shock like the TTX. We're gonna do a debrief here, so I never hear the end of this. And I actually tell brands, any brand that I talk to, can you please make a $400 or $500 shock? That's what the people want. And they all say the same thing. We are a premium brand. We don't make cheap shit. So here's the limited budget shock list I would personally go for in order. I know this was a little bit confusing because it was backwards, but I was trying not to reveal the OHLINS till the end. So number 1 for the cheap coil shocks, it would be the VORO coil shock as long as it fits on your bike because of the large piggyback. If you can find a discontinued Super Deluxe Ultimate with hydraulic bottom mount, it's a pretty legendary shock. Now I'm going to put the DHX in here because it's not a bad shock, it just has limited compression. And I was thinking about this, and it's probably because Fox doesn't want it to compete with the DHX too. So they're like, we can only put low speed compression on there. Now this is the absolute dinosaur that will not die. We'll call this the alligator shock, the Bomber CR. It's got pretty darn good performance, but same deal, limited compression. So basically number 5, I think if you're going for mid-level performance, both of these are about $600. I think the JADE is better, but the RockShox definitely gonna be more reliable and a little bit easier to set up. But don't forget, you can custom tune the JADE, and these guys are legend for helping you out. So if you want advanced performance or advanced reliability, that's basically the choice you choose there. So moving here, here's the best shock for specialized bikes. I personally think it's fucking nonsense that brands build shocks and they're like, it's the bike manufacturer's fault. So if you got a specialized strut, yoke bike, Kenevo, Levo, here's my list of recommendations. I'm not saying I'm right or wrong. You'll still void your warranty if it breaks the frame. So EXT, I think they're the absolute best because we have a 14mm stanchion reinforced eyelet, and most of them have hydraulic bottom mount. The OHLINS 10mm steel stanchion, they claim it's super strong. I've seen a few broken ones on the internet, but they've got some legendary performance or secrets built in there to make it very strong. Suntour VORO again, I think we're just gonna have to award Suntour the GOAT legend for a $400 shock. So I talked to Cane Creek, they approve it on the Kenevo 10mm steel shaft. It looks oddly, the KITSUMA looks oddly similar to the OHLINS as far as the eyelet, same with the VORSPRUNG. They all kind of copied the OHLINS eyelet. So the MRP Hazard, I don't know if this one's discontinued, but I talked to them, and it's a 14mm steel stanchion because they've had shocks before break on specialized bikes. So the RockShox Vivid and the Super Deluxe are pretty strong. Like they're okay for like Levo, Evo, Stump Jumper. According to RockShox, it's a 12mm aluminum stanchion, but it's got a pretty beefy eyelet. The problem with the RockShox is super hard to find the steel stanchion, but it does have hydraulic bottom out. So just remember, I hope you watched that in the video before. I don't want to repeat myself, but coil shocks only break on 90% or more bottom out. We can thank Darren from Push there and DVO Bryce. So the Fox DHX is a pretty stout shock for specialized bikes. I just think the performance of it sucks. The SV8, it's got a steel stanchion. It's just the price tag's a little bit limiting. And if you order an 11.6 for a Levo, it comes with a steel stanchion, but standard, it does come with an aluminum. So the best shock, honestly, for a specialized bike is the TIGON, but you're getting IFP level performance, and I just couldn't set it up. I may be being too hard on the TIGON. Comment if you love it, but if you're a coil shock purist and you love the TIGON, please write me an email ranking these shocks with a lame system, trying to put some sense into here. We have 5 stars possible, and I made a couple of categories like setup, strength, service, package suspension, and cool factor. So coming into first place off the top of my head was the OHLINS. Performance, for sure 5 stars, setup 6 stars because the shock's incredibly easy. 5 stars on strength. It's a pretty common shock, so it gets 5 stars on service. Package suspension. So suspension is a team sport. If you only have a shock and you don't have a fork, I think it's kind of lame. Cool factor, definitely 5 star. So this is where EXT gets let down a little bit. It's hard to set up, but it has the most legendary performance of any shock on this list. Strength, 6 stars for sure. So here is a big let down on EXT. 1 star, has to be sent to an authorized EXT dealer. They won't give you the information or the seal kit, and most shops are like, get that out of here. So moving on to the EXT package suspension, the EXT Era, is that what it's called? 36mm stanchion fork. I don't think it was the best fork I ever rode. There's no replacement for a 38mm stanchion enduro fork. And also the OHLINS package suspension right here, they also make a legendary dual crown fork if you're riding a Coil. So cool factor, EXT is definitely getting 6 stars. That shock goes with any color bike on the market. It's just impressive in person. So the performance of the Mod Shock, I'm just going to guess 5 stars. I haven't rode it. It's Italian, so it's going to be a little finicky. 1 star because basically they don't approve it on Specialized bikes, so it could be pretty weak. I was able to find the seal kit and the instructions, so it's going to get 3 stars for service. I could be wrong. 3 stars for package. So they only make a 35mm stanchion single crown fork, but they do make a dual crown fork, so I give them 3 points. Cool factors, 4 stars for being Italian, but no one knows who you are. The JADE X is $600, 4-star performance is truly impressive. DVO suspension isn't terribly hard to set up. We're giving 3 stars because they didn't go for a steel shaft. Service, 5 stars. Like DVO stuff's super easy to service. You can order all the parts, they'll help you. Legendary company. Packaging and suspension, package suspension on the DVO, 5-star. Their 38 stanchion fork was one of the best ones, or the best one I ever rode. And they make a dual crown fork. Cool factor, we're going 4-star because you may not like green. Moving on to the Push 11.6, I'm giving it 4-star performance from in-person riding because it's an internal floating piston design that's a little bit sluggish compared to the DVO. Setup, we're giving it an extra credit point because they have legendary setup guides, and it's basically 2 shocks in one. The strength of the 11.6, I'm giving it 4 stars because they usually come with an aluminum stanchion. But if you order it for a Levo, it does come with a steel one. It should be automatic 14mm steel stanchion on every shock approved for Specialized bikes. But remember, we have to reserve that for the motorsports brands. They're the only ones who have a set of balls and not a... Let's move on. This is where the VORSPRUNG got downgraded on the list. So performance, same as the Push, 4-star. Setup, it basically comes custom tuned to you, so I'm going to give it 6 stars. It's kind of a generous one there because I don't know how it sets up. We're giving it 4 stars for strength for having a steel stanchion, 1 star for service. Nobody's going to know how to service that. You may need to send it back to Canada, hard to get parts for, etc. Package suspension on the VORSPRUNG, we're getting 0 stars because there's no fork to go with it. Cool factor, getting an extra credit point because VORSPRUNG is a cool company. The IFP EXT shocks, we're giving it 4 stars, just like all the other ones. Anytime you have an internal floating piston, it gets 4 stars. 4 stars for setup because it is a little bit finicky. And I hope you watched that in the video, how to set those up, because I've covered it 100 times. Strength, we're giving 4 stars because they usually have an aluminum stanchion, even though they approve everything, and they do have a reinforced eyelet. 1 star on anything EXT because it's Italian, it's going to break down, it's finicky, it's hard to get parts for, they won't give you the service information. 3 stars again because the EXT Era is a 36mm stanchion fork and it's way out of place. Cool factor, these shocks are old, so they're going down to 4. Moving into the people's shock here with the RockShox Vivid Ultimate. So I initially ranked this thing pretty far down the list, but had to readjust after looking at the whole system here. Performance, pretty average at 3 stars. Setup's easy. Strength, decent, 14. 12mm aluminum stanchion reinforced eyelet. Now this is where the Vivid really comes into play. Service, excellent. Every bike shop on the earth is going to be able to service this. The package is excellent. Go Zeb or Boxer. Cool factor, I'm not going to say it's cool, but it's cool. We'll just say it's cool because it's new. So moving back into the Gucci brands with the Push SV8 at $865. Performance is definitely going to be better than the Vivid, but looking at the whole system here isn't ideal. Setup, pretty difficult. It's not like the 11.6, doesn't have tailored setup guide. Strength, 5-star, steel stanchion. Service. So 1 star for sure. There's only going to be a few shops in the country or the world who's going to be able to service this. The package suspension system of the Push is a little disappointing with a $2,600 fork, putting that fork out of reach of most people. Cool factor, I'm going to say it's not cool because you're just a peasant who can't afford an 11.6. Moving into the most famous coil shock on the market, I'm only giving it 4 stars of performance. Remember, it's marketing and putting the best athletes on the world to win races. It's not really the hardware, so don't be fooled by the marketing. If you put the best Fox racer on a VORO, on a Sun Tour, he'd probably win the race as well. So performance 4 stars, setup 0 stars. This is a pretty difficult shock to set up. Strength 0 stars, most famous shock on the internet to break. Service, just like the RockShox, 6 stars on service, 6 stars on package. Cool factor, you're riding Fox stuff. I'm going to give it an extra credit point. Into the most underrated piece of suspension on the entire list is the DVO JADE. I mean the rebadged Suntour VORO. So performance 4 star. I'm literally ranking this above the Vivid. But that's not the entire story. So it's super easy to set up the Suntour VORO. All you got to do is put 180 PSI in the piggyback and never touch it again. Like basically adjust the rebound, you're done. Find your spring rate. So strength 5 stars with its 14mm steel stanchion. Unknown eyelet. Suntour don't even know what they have. So service, I could service this with a crescent wrench and it's like 4 O-rings, but a shop literally laughed me out of the door when I asked them to service it. Package suspension, they do have a dual crown fork and a 38mm stanchion fork, but it's also Suntour, so you're getting knocked down to 4 stars. And cool factor, there's nothing cool about riding Suntour no matter how many athletes they put on their suspension. So coming into number 12. Cane Creek KITSUMA Coil. So if you could get this set up right, it is a non-internal floating piston, so it's a bladder style shock. So it's going to have some pretty legendary performance if it's working and if you can get it set up right. So setup's going to be a little bit difficult. We have high speed rebound adjust, which just complicates things for no reason. Strength pretty decent, 10mm steel stanchion, copying the OHLINS as far as appearance goes. Service, I'm going to give it 2 stars. They do have online repair manuals, but the shop was like, we're not buying their tools. Nobody rides that stuff. So the package suspension is getting 2 stars because there's only a 35mm stanchion fork to go with your DH rated coil shock. It's pretty dumb. And there's nothing cool about Gecko, so 1 star on cool factor. Here we go on the DVO. So the DVO is a non-internal floating piston, so you get 4 stars on performance. You might rank this 3 stars because it doesn't exactly have a lot of small bump sensitivity. That is like 50 pounds of breakaway pressure on the $10,000 dyno. But overall, I'm going to give it 4 stars. Setup's pretty easy on the DVO. It could go back and forth here between 3 and 4 stars. Strength, 4 stars. I did run this on my Specialized Kenevo, even though it's not approved. 14mm aluminum stanchion, but a reinforced eyelet. Everything is pretty middle of the road here. That's why I rank it so high. Package suspension is 5 stars. The 38mm stanchion fork is legendary with the optional dual crown option. So I'm going to knock it down on the cool factor because you may not like green. I'm personally a black and white guy. So let's move on to the JADE. It's the same as the Suntour VORO. Like it's the same chassis and DVO's own non-internal floating piston design, so this could actually be 5 stars, maybe the most underrated shock on the list. So setup, I'm giving it 4 stars. Probably knock this down anyway. Package suspension is 5 stars, dual crown fork or the 38mm stanchion DVO. So cool factor is pretty old, so you're getting 3 stars. So I never rode the MRP Hazard, maybe discontinued, but I'm going to give it 3 stars for its internal floating piston design, and basically it's a chain guide company from my perception. 4 stars on setup just because I'm feeling generous for the small brands. Strength, definitely 5 stars with a 14mm steel stanchion with Specialized bikes in mind. We're going to give this 1 or 2 stars on service because basically I've never seen one of these in real life and will not buy one unless they're non-discontinued. Package suspension, you're getting 2 stars because they only have a 35mm stanchion fork and there's nothing cool about a chain guide instead of a fork. Moving into the Super Deluxe Ultimate, this was not a very impressive shock from my opinion as far as performance. Setup is incredibly easy, strength decent, and then just like your normal stuff, you get 6 stars on service. Everybody can service these. Package is awesome with the Zeb and the Boxer. Cool star, cool rating. You can barely tell the difference between a Coil and a Vivid. It's like a sticker change, externally speaking. So we're going to give it 4 stars. It's definitely a pretty cool shock. Moving into the old school MARZO Bomber coil shock, definitely a 3-star performance. Setup is 4 because you got nothing to adjust. 3 stars for strength because it's a pretty weak aluminum stanchion and Fox. We'll just leave it there. So service, definitely 6 stars. Package is 5 stars. You can go Super Z or the MARZO dual crown fork. Cool factor, there's nothing cool about being a peasant. The X-Fusion is something I want to buy, but I just can't waste my time doing this stuff. So 3 stars for the performance of the X-Fusion, not having rode it. 3-position compression adjust. I'm going to give it 4 stars on setup. That was one of the most easiest things about the OHLINS was that 3-position thing. So strength looks decent with a 14mm aluminum stanchion. Service, you're only getting 2 stars because I could find the video online on how to service it. No shop's going to want to service that. Package suspension is shockingly 5 stars with a 38mm stanchion fork and a dual crown fork. And nothing cool about having a dropper post brand instead of a fork. Moving into the DHX. I may have been too hard in this with 3-star performance, but with the lack of compression control, I gotta knock it way down. So Fox is on a campaign to make these shocks cool again, and there's nothing cool about them. They're basically weird trail shocks that need high-speed compression. So setup is 5 stars because there's nothing to adjust. Do not waste your time adjusting it. I did that for you. So strength is definitely 5 stars. This comes on the 2023 Kenevo, which is a long yoke strut bike. So Fox can build strong shocks if they want to, but they choose not to. That's just typical mountain bike stuff. So definitely 6 stars for service on any Fox product because you can find all the tools generic on eBay or bring it to the shop. Package suspension, as usual with Fox, 6 stars for your 38 and Fox 40. Cool factor, nothing cool about a DHX. You're like, why aren't you on a DHX too, bro? Into the DHX Live Valve Neo. So the performance, I never rode this. I will actually buy one to make a video. I'm only gonna rank it 1 point extra because it's got the same massive main piston making a lot of friction. I am gonna give it 5 stars for setup, maybe 6 stars because it will open and close the compression on the climb. Definitely all the same stuff. It's just an unknown performance level, and Fox is doing its best to basically put talented athletes on this shock to act like it's actually a good shock, which it could be. It's an undecided question. But with a $1,400 price tag, I don't know what to say. But interestingly, like if I was a robot media outlet, I would be like, oh, this is the best one. It's got 32 points. But in reality, this is one of the worst shocks on the list. Not the worst, but just middle of the road. Moving on to the Cane Creek inline coil. So I've heard good things about these, but I'm still going to give it 3-star performance. You really shouldn't be on a coil shock on a short travel bike anyway. Setup 1 star on anything Cane Creek, super difficult. Not very strong shock, not approved for the Levo, so there's maybe some weak structure inside of it. 1 star for service. Package suspension, we're knocking this up to 3 stars because they do make a 35mm stanchion fork that is appropriate for trail bikes. Once again, nothing cool about geckos. Redo your marketing. Moving into a Deluxe Coil Select, we're going to give this 1-star performance because it's basically a placeholder. 5-star setup because you got 20 clicks of rebound. There's nothing to adjust. 3 stars because we got the same 12.5mm stanchion as the Vivid and the Super Deluxe. 6 stars for all this stuff. Cool factor, nothing cool about this. So my least favorite shock in the entire list that should be in an air shock category is the Cane Creek TIGON. Performance is 2-star on a coil shock rating system. If you are an air shock guy, you might be perfectly fine with the TIGON. But if you're a coil purist, this gets 2 stars for a coil shock. 0, I'm going to give this -2 stars for setup because this was the most challenging setup thing I ever did. Cane Creek needs to recall these and remove the digressive shim stacks, so they're basically progressive shim stacks. The strength of the TIGON is incredible. I for sure would have broke a DHX2 on my specialized status going off this hook to flat in the front of the video. So service, 0 stars. It's a new product from Cane Creek, so no one's gonna be able to service that except for Cane Creek. Package suspension, you're talking about the most downhill oriented shock I've ever rode with a 35mm stanchion fork. You're getting 1 star for that, and there's nothing cool about Cane Creek. So let's take all those points and try to put them in a fairly just order. So the highest ranking off the point system is the DHX Live Valve, trying to be a fair judge here. OHLINS coming in number 2. Now putting the DHX and the OHLINS in the same category is the stupidest thing ever. So trying to be a fair judge can be kind of stupid. I do agree with this. The Vivid's middle of the road performance, but everything else is pretty good as well. So you can just basically decide which area is the most important to you, because I think this is stupid looking at my point system. Let's move on to a quick section on coil springs. So throughout the 8 months I rode many different springs. And I personally find the EXT 600 pound spring to have more small bump sensitivity. According to Steve from VORSPRUNG, all springs are the same and it's placebo or an optical illusion. I do agree with Steve from VORSPRUNG that there was no difference between a DVO lightweight spring here and a $40 taller RockShox spring. But I will disagree with Steve. The difference in performance, I feel like I could feel the difference between the spring decks and the EXT. I would all day choose the spring decks because I can adjust the spring rate to different conditions and weight I'm riding. But all out performance, there's no arguing that OHLINS uses a stubby spring for good reason. And OHLINS is definitely smarter than Steve at VORSPRUNG. I'm a huge fan of the spring decks, so get one if you're on a coil curious adventure because it's really going to help you out. So if you want to know how I set all my shocks up, click this video on your screen because I spent months setting this video up to make a system.